Michael, how are you? And the wonderful and only Sam. Oh my goodness. Michael, how are you on this fine evening? You doing all right?
Oh, doing splendid. How are you?
Splendid. I am good. We have met. Oh, and it is Sam Willem. Oh my goodness. It is good to see you, Sam. We are well. We have gotten all of the different adventures down the road. Four kids in a car for 2 hours. That's cool. But Paul just sleeps a lot, so that's good. And we are well. And the ice is melted. Hopefully it is done. We had so many pine trees come down. Sam, we had a pine tree fall on a power line, and then they turned the power back on and it exploded. And like literally the tree exploded. And a power line went across the road. You couldn't drive over it. It was really an adventure. The kids thought it was amazing. Of course.
Did it like smell good? Did it like exude pine?
Yeah, everyone went down.
Like
It's like,
that would have been a great silver lining if like yeah, you have this exploding tree, but it's like it smells like Christmas.
you know,
It's like the world's largest incense burner.
actually, that's probably what it was. People down the road were probably like, "This is delightful," and they're not trapped on the other side of an electric wire. They're like, "Oh my gosh, I can actually sit next to my trash can and feel at peace." It was really great. But no, we are well. I hope everyone is doing well. I'd be curious what anyone is thinking about absolutely anything at all. Sam, your writing as always is stunning. Your recent Substacks have been beautiful, so thank you for them. And Michael, I love your poetry. So
Yes, I second that.
yes, Michael is
I'm a
correct.
recent follow to Sam, so I've been admiring. I think I restacked your I think it was called The Geometry of
That was really good.
Oh,
Gender. That was excellent. I really loved that one. It like randomly percolates in my mind sphere. Yeah, I thought that one was really well done.
thank you. Yeah, it's funny how sometimes it's just like flows out of you, like you're like, "Oh, okay, it's just making sense right now." Like,
Oh yeah.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about actually like what's going on in your Substack kind of, Daniel, like the meta modernism discussion
Mm.
that you had with Greg, I think his name is. That's been really good. And I've really just been like down like a rabbit hole of theories of everything. Um, Also looking at Brendan Graham Dempsey, who wrote the Universal Learning Process, I think. And I know he's involved also in metamodernism as a like conceptual nexus. Yeah, that's what I've been thinking about. What have you guys been thinking about?
Well, I've been thinking about that as well. And I mean, not to jump in, but I really did appreciate Dimber's work in emphasizing the coming point, because a lot of the idea of metamodernism in aesthetics has centered on this quote unquote oscillation between modernism and postmodernism. And that's
Mhm.
not bad. And Greg even makes the point that in Tim and D. Robin, their original work, metamodernism as a aesthetic theory came out of examining paintings, and paintings don't move. So oscillation was not necessarily the key term, but it's really kind of caught on this idea of kind of moving between. But you see, the reason why, for me, that can be incomplete, because why isn't that just existential anxiety? Like, what is the difference between the metamodern oscillation that defends interiority and, say, existentialism, right? Why would not The Fall by Camus be a defense of interiority or something, right? Because you could argue that, or why not The Stream of Consciousness in Joyce, or The Man Without Qualities, like these kind of works on subjectivity that you see in that work, for example, right? Like, what is the precise characteristic? What is the precise technical difference between interiority in a meta-modern work of art and interiority in a modern and a postmodern work, right? Because you could look at Snow White by Donald Barthelmessi. I can never say his name, dang it. Obviously Bart with Into the Funhouse or Tidewater Tales or different things. And you could argue there's plenty of interiority here, right? And even Greg makes the key point that, yeah, to say that metamodern art is the first that's dealing with interiority would be silly. So what is the key difference? For me, the main idea, and we talk about it all the time with the clearing and Heidegger or apathetic, is that a metamodern work is going to introduce, just as you're about to be able to categorize it as postmodern, it introduces romanticism or modernism or something, and then you have to go the other way. And just before you're able to get there, it introduced postmodern, it goes the other way, like a mental game of chess. And eventually what ends up happening is in that movement, you're not able to classify what the work is. But in that inability to classify, what ends up happening is you say, well, I don't know what this work is, but what I do know is the emotional interiority of the characters coming forth, like a kind of clearing. So it's functioning to create an apathetic effect, really, where it's not telling, like in Joyce, I'm telling you everything going on in the interiority of the character. Whereas in a metamodern work, I'm just making a space where you can feel it, but I actually don't do a stream of consciousness or show you all of those things. I make it actually more veiled, but in that veil, like at the end of Cabin in the Woods or Beast in the Southern Wild, then et cetera, then actually there is a deeper emotional experience that, here's the funny thing, I am more likely to believe in precisely because it is more apathetic and hidden and it just comes forth versus, and also there's a critical idea of what is the difference between that and emotionalism, where a character is just being emotional, right? It's this very particular effect that comes through that feels very, very genuine and real. And it's very hard to design. And the reason I like to talk with Denver is because I like the conversation to get what are the technical, artistic skills needed to create a kind of metamodern effect, for example. Like what needs to be done? Like without giving it away, like in a story that we have in Under the Wing called Heroes, there's this tension between what is real in the story and what is not real in the story. Is everything going on in the character a hallucination or not? And the reason this is done is precisely so that you actually focus on the interiority or emotional experience of the character Eve, actually, and what ultimately occurs. And by not having necessarily clarity on what is true and what is not, that's not to deny the question of truth, but actually to make space to feel genuine the effects of the characters when they come through. Now, more that can be, now, the way to perhaps think about this in light of things like the Nordic Bildung, Lena Anderson on metamodernism, you can get to Dempsey on his book on the learning process. He also has a book on Emergentism and different things, is the idea, and now Greg Denver correctly points out that the aesthetic movement of metamodernism did not start necessarily seeing itself as part of integral theory. Ken Wilber, complexity science, some of them can see that as kind of different, right? And so there are very important differences here. If I were to suggest a common theme that should not overlook difference, it's like saying there are democratic nations where there are different forms of democracy. So what do we mean, right? There's a certain idea that, and then I'll stop for whoever wants to say anything. There's a certain idea that this interiority that is best apathetically approached. I think that's also key. It is best apathetically approached, not made capathetic. And I really do think the religious terms are very useful here. I know we use the apathetic language all the time, but I think we do have to realize for most of theological history, these terms have not been used as much as they can now seem to be, right? And most of, say, Western theology has certainly not been apathetic in the way that perhaps it should have been. Now, you could argue someone like a Karl Barth in Church Dogmatics is trying to kind of restore that against Greek categories, blah, blah, blah. But certainly there's an idea that whatever this interiority human beings have, if it is given space to breathe or it is given a clearing in the school system, in the Nordic school system, then actually there's remarkable personal development, say in Lena Anderson or Thomas Bockmann, and their wonderful book, The Nordic Secret, I highly suggest, and I like to read it together with Dietrich McCloskey's work. I think there's some importance there. Once you also get into things like complexity science, there's also this idea that we really can't predict complex theories. What we need is a fundamental that, if put in the right environment, actually has a certain latent potential that can come out. And I'm also overlaying that with the language of, say, a Michael Levin. There's this idea that actually things, if just put in the right environment, sprout, if they will, right? They contain everything you need. They just need the environment, because there's not a hard distinction between environment and thing, right? Which gets to many conversations we've had on, say, architecture and things like that, Christopher Alexander and so on, right? I definitely think an overarching theme of all forms of metamodernism is an appreciation of, I kind of want to say architecture. Now, by architecture, I don't just mean obviously building, but I'm going to throw meta. I'm going to say meta architecture that is critical for the design of art, for the thinking of science, for reapproaching what exactly the universe is doing, how school is best done. And I think this meta architecture is basically a certain, how do we create an apathetic environment where, again, I can't help but think of it like if I think about the temple in Judaism, for example, it is kind of apathetic because if you go behind the veil, you die, but you know where the apathetic is. That's kind of the funny thing. Like the funny thing about the apathetic is I have to know it enough to know it's apathetic. If I don't know it at all, it's nothing, right? So you have to create a way to point to something being apathetic, because if it is entirely veiled, then it's not even in a sense apathetic. It's kind of nothingness. You don't even know it's there. So you have to create temples, rituals, environments to make people aware of a thing that they can never be entirely aware of without destroying it, which is the really weird balancing act, right? Like apathetic is where you make it too present. Apathetic in a weird way always fundamentally has to be a certain balance. Like it has to be a certain like amount of revealing that you can kind of make sense of what's going on, but not so much you're overwhelmed. And basically, I would say you see in all of these kind of, and then again, anyone who wants to speak, there's certain awareness of how do we in the school system actually create some sort of acknowledgement of some interiority that has to be brought out that is apathetic, but also not nothingness. How do we have a certain scientific theory that is understanding that really it's about an environment to let something come out that even if we don't fully understand it, we do know of the conditions by which the thing comes forth. And what would it also mean to think of kind of the universe as finding itself out in the process of its being? Because when I read Mr. Dempsey's work, there's a notion of the universe as learning, right? In a way, this almost ties, now this would not be technically correct, of a classic kind of process theology idea that God actually is not omniscient. Like God actually is learning. He creates to know, right? Like he kind of like God's actually learning. And, there are different people that use that idea, but there's a way in which the universe is learning about itself. But in a way, it always at all points knows everything there is to know, but it's always a moment later becoming more. So it's this weird thing where it's complete, but also unfolding. And that's how you kind of figure out the balance between like a God that knows everything, but also is ever creating, right? And in theologies, different process theologies, maybe Whitehead, but Whitehead, I will not claim any massive expertise on it, like a Dr. Segal or someone like that. But there's certainly that kind of notion. So those are some general ideas that are in the metamodern space that I find very interesting. And I really appreciate Denver's book on bringing it into art. And I'd be curious on any thoughts about anything from anyone.
Yeah, I like to pick up on the apophatic, your emphasis on the apophatic. I'm in this class right now called The Poetics of Enchantment, and this week we read The Fairy Queen by Spenser, for the first book of it. And one thing that I was really struck by in reading it is that you have this character, the Red Cross Knight, who's like trying to, slay this dragon on, that was like torturing the Fairy Queen essentially. And like, he trying to accomplish that quest, he's like encountering all of these characters that like one Duessa in particular who like represents falsehood, and she's kind of this like seduction artist siren type character that like masquerades as this like virtuous person, and she actually creates like a false version that resembles like the protagonist of the story that he's supposed to save, in hopes that he would be tempted by that and kind of get distracted. And like throughout the book, he's like constantly encountering these characters that force him to like wisely discern like what is truth from what is not truth. And it was just interesting. Like we have a Discord with all the people in the class, and some people were talking about how like the story didn't really come across very enchanting because he's kind of constantly just having to like like wisely, like rationally, like not be tempted instead of this like encounter with divine love and this very like cataphatic, like positive theology. Like it's very like negative theological book. And like I made the point that like I wouldn't use the word rational, I would use the word discernment to describe what was happening in the story. And like the apophatic is I kind of just made the case for like the apophatic, and that like the apophatic is just as vital for a deeply spiritual life as the cataphatic, because as someone in my class, correctly noted, like you can't know what the sacred is unless you know what the profane is as well. And so I think like a big part of it seems like what metamodern education is not espousing this one dominant ideology, whereas the postmodern move is to kind of both deconstruct the the institutional dominant ideologies, but there's also a profession of a replacement ideology in that as well. And it seems like the metamodern move is to say, um, like, and instead of orienting towards this like crystallized vision of like what education ought to be or what we ought to believe, it's much more about creating arenas and creating spaces that people can play in. But again, it's like it's not complete chaos. It's like those spaces do have to kind of be organized and like oriented towards something greater. And it seems like a big part of metamodernism is the emphasis on transcendence, is the emphasis on your ability to like die to yourself, or the ability for an institution to die to itself, to transcend. And yeah, just briefly before I give it back, like I wrote a short story a little while ago that I know Daniel read, and it was about this girl who is like really passionate about the environment, but she like really has like a fraught relationship with her family and like a fraught relationship with people, and the nature preserve that she loves, she finds out is like going to get torn down, and like the town has like 30 days to kind of rally for it, and she realizes that like she can't both like keep her love for this preserve and also not participate in like a social coordinated effort to save it. And so she kind of has to like die to herself in like her reasons for not liking people essentially, and like kind of be like participate in like the greater world. And yeah, that was kind of like an attempt to like create a story that like deals with those kinds of themes. So yeah, I'd be curious what anyone has to say about that.
Beautiful.
And we lost Javier.
Dang it. Well, Javier, thank you. Good to see you. I'll give it to Sam. No, it's just as a very quick note. It's very interesting. The tension of speaking and trying to be enchanting destroys it. Trying to speak and have an emotional moment destroys it. You have to get at things indirectly. There's some sort of secret to things are real approached indirectly. Truth is slant, right? As Miss Dickinson might say. So there's this weird problem where we don't believe in things that come too directly, but then how do you be direct about indirectness? That almost by definition seems to be environmental or design or architectural, et cetera, so forth. But so it's what you were saying on the Fairy Queen, et cetera, so forth was lovely. But let me give it to Miss Sam. Sam, please.
Yeah, like I think what you're talking about with the sacred and profane is really interesting, Michael, because when Daniel was talking about the temple is a place where you know where the beyond lies, like it's given a really strong architectural definition. Um, there's like there's really strong organization of boundaries between the sacred and the profane, which is kind of like what you're talking about, having these things really really separate. Um, but it's like I think like the important thing is that when you're being indirect, like when you're trying to leverage some apophatic approach, it's just as potentially meaningless as nothingness, unless it's like an indexical negation, right? Like it can't just be a negation. Like it needs to like be a constellation of negations, right? Like that. So. I think, yeah, like there's form there, right? Like in a loose, I'm using that term loosely. But uh yeah, so I mean I'm really interested in this, and like my brain is just going crazy as I delve into it, because I do think it's so architecturally applicable. Daniel, you've known me for like a really long time. Like, kind of, I left my master's feeling a little disenchanted with academia, which sort of relates to, Daniel, what you were saying about how the metamodern isn't really championed at all in the institutions. And like, I did not find that at all. And it's like, okay, well, we have modern architecture, we have postmodern architecture, we have all these isms of architecture, but nobody's really like trying to question what a metamodern architecture could be. So in that way, I was really interested, just like with Denver's take on it, like in literature, because like these things have like analogical correspondences. But then in like the larger cloud of thought, like bringing in Dempsey and Levin and actually Segal with Whitehead, it's like I wanted to speak to what you were talking about with like early kind of earlier in what you were saying, sorry, Daniel, about the like the deferring categorization. It's interesting, I think, because, and I think like rather than just like saying like, oh, there's this oscillation between or braiding in the case of Denver, between modernism and postmodernism, it's like categorization is so important to modernism. It's so important to postmodernism. So it's to sort of like defer it or to like indexically negate it. I think that is really like something new and something fresh rather than just like an oscillation between two old things, so to speak. Um, and uh, in terms of like the interiority, and like the interiority that is sort of being preserved and or like not preserved, but like evoked, engaged, portrayed in a metamodernist work. Um, I was I was talking to my great aunt. I was talking to my great aunt this evening. We call quite frequently, and uh, she was trying to explain like she was saying she has all these basically these like toolboxes full of tools. But she was like describing them in minute detail. She's like, they're probably 4 inches by 18 inches by 6 inches, and they have several compartments in them, various cells, little pockets. I don't know, like she very well could have just said, I've got some toolboxes. Like, does your brother need them? Like that's it would have sufficed, but it was as though she thought that I had never been to Canadian Tire before. And I don't know, I just like I love my aunt, but I was having a very hard time sort of relating to her, and then I'm thinking also like, like the back of my mind was always buzzing with just like, whatever I'm thinking about as I'm experiencing things. And I'm thinking a little bit um about this idea of like learning um and your relationship to your environment and the way that like can expand your cognitive light cone in the language of Levin. And I was just like thinking like I wonder like what I think I just recognized suddenly I had like this glimpse of a gulf between her experience and my own, and then the fact that like you know, like our subjectivity is it's irreducible to one another and it's private. Like I really felt that in that moment, and and I think th yeah, it's like I feel like metamodernism can sort of like grapple with that gulf. Like I've also been I put out that piece and I had quotes in it from Conrad, Heart of Darkness, which obviously is like an older piece. And in it, he talks about dreaming and how when we're dreaming, there are these ineffable sensations and you know just experiences that you have through the dream states. And basically, I noticed just that at a sort of analytical level, like how he was describing it was through just negation, like he's calling it ineffable. He's like not describing it. He's saying that it can't be described. And just by negating it, you do get a sense of, oh yes, I have dreamt. I know those qualia of experience that I can't convey also. But it's just a negation, I think, what Conrad's doing. He's not, there's no like coordinated negation so as to make a particular qualia shine through. And that's like kind of, you know, that's where we could go, you know, like maybe one day I will be able to more effectively evoke whatever that ineffable feeling of my aunt, of who my great aunt is, you know, because there's something about her describing these little toolboxes that it's her, you know. Anyways, yeah, that's what I got.
No, well, magnificent. Well, there's a bunch of things. So, you know, one of the things, metamodernism is absolutely new. But when it describes itself, or is it only understood as an oscillation? That's why I really like where Dimber uses the metaphor of braiding, because also braiding gets me to where I can start thinking saturation, and now I'm thinking Alex Ebert's freak theory. And when you get a saturation, you get a phase trend, you get something new comes up, that kind of comes out of it, right? The reason why I also really like this is because what is being described is only gotten if it is experienced. And it has to be very technically designed. Modernism now you can kind of recognize, right? There is techniques to modernism, right? But there's a way in which if modernism is, say, certain techniques, like, you know, the use of mythic method from T.S. Eliot, right? Where like Joyce's Ulysses is using the Odyssey, and every episode of A Day in Dublin is playing on the different islands and stuff like that, right? Or if obviously we can go on, right? Or Conrad in The Secret Agent talking the method of focalization, which actually I think is central here, because the idea that the story will be told differently based on the point of view of the character. We're very used to that, but that was more of a modern invention. That was not something that we see in literature. We see different characters, but different descriptions of the events with different wording and like that. Virginia Woolf, all of that is quite modern, right? And focalization coming out of that. And I can keep going, but here's the issue. All of those are techniques that if you see, you say, oh, that's the technique. It doesn't have to create a certain emotional effect to be itself. If you don't feel anything while reading Absalom, it is still obviously modern, right? The brilliant, and I think the same can be said of postmodern, basically. Like, you don't necessarily have to feel anything. What's critical about metamodern is it is not metamodern if it does not create a certain effect. That's a really high stakes game, and it is very difficult. If it does not create this effect, then it simply oscillates, right? It simply, and you could argue, and I was speaking with Dimber about this, if it simply moves between modern and postmodern, in a way that's kind of modern. Because, you know, Joyce is moving between different voices and techniques and references. You know, you see in modernism a movement between different eras, E-R-A-S, of literature, right? So if all you're doing is moving between those, you could just say that that's almost a modernist technique, actually, right? So how does it become, and you see also, I should note, sometime in cultural analysis, it can sound just picky, or, oh, it's not quite modern, oh, it's not, it just sounds like you're kind of being picky. But actually, if literature And Owen Barfield basically says this, if literature is actually an artifact of consciousness, like it is literally an artifact of consciousness, then the slight differences of the text actually suggest slight variations in consciousness and modes of understanding, right? So we're not simply identifying differences for the sake of who's going to win the debate, is Ulysses modern or not, right? It's to say, no, there's a difference here, that actually consciousness and society and et cetera, so forth, for that difference to have arisen, must have changed somehow. Something must be going on. And often what's going on is something that has not been recognized, that needs to be recognized because it's bubbling up, right? And that's what kind of Denver's getting at. Like, people are hungry to not have their interiority gaslit anymore, basically told your interiority doesn't matter. So people are hungry for that. So it's coming out in art, and artists on a subconscious level are creating technique and design to bring it out, even if they don't necessarily consciously know what they're doing. That could be the genius of the artist, to be able to do very complicated things according to intuition or felt sense, et cetera, so forth, right? No hierarchy in those things. But the key here that I think is, and I'll give it to Michael, that's extremely fascinating about metamodern, is in order to be itself, the stakes are very high on itself. Like, it really has to succeed at quilting and braiding together the elements so you can't categorize it, because it would be real easy to be avant-garde, right? Avant-garde is, in a sense, you can't categorize it. You don't know what it is. But what is the difference between the way metamodernism resists categorization and the way avant-garde resists categorization, right? There's a difference there. And by going down the kind of chain of saying, well, it's not existential anxiety, blah, 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 you start to say, no, there's something else going on here. But to me, and I think this in some respects is kind of exciting for art, because a lot of people are like, art is dead or whatever. No, there's this new form of extremely technical, apt storytelling in art, and I think architecture as well comes into this, that actually opens up a new way of doing these things that is very difficult, but is extremely distinct, and you apprehend its occurrence if it is successful. You say, yes, that worked. That actually happened. So it's in a sense testable. Like, this is what's also weird about it. Like, if it creates this particular emotional effect, it's actually, in a way, I don't know if I want to say empirical, but it's almost like testable, right? It's not merely a style, because it is fundamentally a relation, not a subject-object divide. Like, it really has to, like, make you feel this effect, right? And if it doesn't, it failed. And there's a weird way in which that's like an emotional empiricism, just to use a fancy phrase. Whereas a work like modernism or postmodernism is not, it's more in the realm of taste, or certainly, or checking off certain boxes of the technique that we would expect to see. So there's something very unique there. I'll pause and give it to Michael, but wonderful. There was much more to say. Actually, on the grandmother, that was really important. It makes me think of David Foster Wallace, who's important in this. But let me give it to Michael here. Michael.
Yeah, just as Sam is kind of thinking about like what metamodern architecture looks like, as a therapist to be, I'm thinking of like what a metamodern therapy would look like. And as you were talking, I was thinking like, what would because I haven't really come across like people applying these labels to, mental health care. So I'm just kind of, thinking out loud. But I was thinking like, what would what would the era of modern therapy be? What would the era of postmodern therapy be? And then what could metamodern therapy be? And I feel like modern therapy was like pre, I would say like pre-humanistic psychology, where you were, as a clinician, you were very married to the DSM. You were kind of in the business of, diagnosing, categorizing people based on certain disorders, illnesses, and, it was like very kind of cut and dry. Like, if someone has X disorder, Y treatment is applied, and it's like this very kind of point A to point B kind of thing. Um, and then I feel like a lot of the humanistic psychologists came in and were introducing um, a lot of new kind of ideas and language around, well, what if like symptoms are, not just someone's unique like personal failings that are rigid and unchanging, but like, what if it's subject to their environment, subject to like the social field that they're in, the societal narratives that they're encountering, and like, if someone could really come to terms with that and like come to terms with their own interiority, um, a lot of that kind of existential angst, anxiety, strife, um, could be like relieved and dissolved. But then I feel like it kind of got to a point where people were like, well, like, kind of any like people started like diagnosing themselves on TikTok and like, oh, like I have this or I have that, or like this is such and such, or that's and then you kind of get what Greg Enriquez talks about with like the kind of death of like a unified theory of psychotherapy where we're at now, where it's like, you have so many different modalities that could be used for a given thing. We don't really even have a consensus on like, what does it mean to have ADHD, or what does it mean to like have autism? Um, and I wonder what a metamodern therapy could be. I feel like it has to involve this, yeah, this like this real sense of um like exploring the depths of one's interiority, but like also, yeah, also kind of having this like constellation of like what is this all for? Like, because like I've encountered a lot of people and been in a lot of situations where, there's like this emphasis on like, you know, uh freedom of emotional expression and like real kind of mining of one's own psyche. But I always get to a certain point where I'm like, but like what is it all for? Like like what is the kind of so what of this all? Like what do we do once we have all the tears and then we like end, like where do we go from here? Um and and I feel like that's where the kind of modernism can come in. And again, I guess, not offer like one answer to it, but this this kind of runway for someone to like start to walk on towards like a greater kind of opening and expansiveness towards beauty. I know Jockin talks about that as like an orienting uh principle, um and 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 I feel like that's something that is kind of currently um missing, but I feel like it's kind of getting revivified. So yeah, I know that was a very personal exploration, but yeah, I'm sure it's somehow gonna connect
No, I think
braid
that
to
I
everything
think
else.
that's magnificent. So there's a few things, and then anyone who wants to speak at all. When we think about interiority, another way to think about it can be you have to be in it to get it. Like if you're in it, you can understand it. If you're outside of it, you don't get it. And mentioning Dr. Segal with Whitehead, there's a notion. Obviously, people emphasize everything is relational, right? And by relations, they're ontological, right? Well, one of the interesting ideas with metamodern, depending on the ability of creating a certain effect in the viewer and the reader, is that's a relation, right? Like you could say a modern work's modern, whether you like it or not. It is a modern work. It doesn't matter if it created the effect or not, right? But a metamodern work is really kind of putting its stakes on the idea of the ability to create a certain effect in the characters and really in the viewers as well, if it does it well, right? Like there's another way to look at this. A modern work is one that you find evidence in the text that it is modern or postmodern, okay? A metamodern work, to me, now again, I'm speaking from my own take on going through the literature and reading different texts. All of this can be incorrect critical analysis. So take it with a grain of salt. But for me, metamodernism is a gestalt, fundamentally a gestalt. Every work of metamodernism is gestalt, is a whole, right? You don't find evidence it is metamodern. The whole hits you in a certain way that then you go, oh, wow, that's metamodern. Oh, now I see it everywhere, almost, right? Like it has more of a bam, hit you, get it. Whereas, in another way to put this, Like, I would wager, if you never heard of any category of art at all, right? Like you didn't know any of them, and you read a modern work, a postmodern, and a metamodern work, the kind of wager of a metamodern work is that that one would hit you different than the others. Now, you could argue all art hits you differently. I understand that. But it's to hit you in a certain way of a certain interiority, a certain emotional effect is coming through. It must be felt. I think that's basically a kind of idea that the apprehension leads the logic. Okay, like the feltness, like apprehension as a mental activity, which I associate apprehension with Gestalt. Like you apprehend and then you go logically. Like modernism and postmodernism is logic. Like you may have no idea what's going on in Gravity's Rainbow. You won't have any idea of what's going on in Gravity's Rainbow or William Gibson or any of these books. You will not know. But that's the game. That's the wager, dang it. So it's logic all the way down in a certain respect or rationality. Now, critically, before no, this is very important. It is not necessarily the case that modern, it's not like metamodern good, modern bad, postmodern bad. All of these have a role in their own work, and there are great works of literature that are clearly modern in their modernness. And so it's not like a hierarchy. It's not saying metamodern is best. Modern, I mean, obviously, you can't even get to metamodern without the other techniques and ways of doing things, right? So this isn't like a hierarchy, but another way to look at cultural analysis is if you're like, I'm currently in an industry or I'm in art and it just seems like it's not working. Like you just intuit something is not working. Well, then a new framework might be needed that maybe in previous ages wasn't needed and maybe next week won't be needed anymore. But one of the ways to think about cultural analysis, if you can identify a new thing occurring, then that can give you an option to turn to if what you're currently doing in literature, in architecture, in therapy is not working. Then if you knew of these different options, it may give you something to try to help get through the impasse you are currently experiencing, right? So that's one way to think about it, is it's different ways of thinking that that the more of those you have and understand, the less likely you're to get, say, stuck somewhere. I almost, a Nash equilibrium, a rational, something where the preset understanding won't let you advance anymore, right? So the point is this, is that, like, again, you have works, obviously great modern, and then I'll give it to Sam, great modern literature, great modern poetry. No one is going to say The Wasteland or Notes to a Supreme Fiction by is a bad work, right? But the idea is that a metamodern work, in order to make itself distinct, and also seemingly is emerging in response to some sort of feeling that we've existed in an age that have claimed subjectivity, relationships, interiority don't matter. There's some sort of, a certain sort of standing up occurring in this work that says, no, this does matter. But then there's also enough postmodern deconstruction to be skeptical of emotionalism. That's sort of a key here. The postmodernism is actually really good for metamodernism, because without it, it would actually slip into simple emotionalism or atomized individualism or stuff like that, right? This is where postmodern being the boogeyman that has destroyed the West or whatever, which is a popular notion and that we hear, is problematic, because actually postmodernity is what would actually come in and be like, hey, emotionalism, let's not necessarily, are you so sure that won't be used by the corporations in power to their benefit? That's the cynicism of postmodernity that actually comes in and reminds you, oh, wait, when I think I'm being an individual and standing up, that's just what the corporations want me to do. A little bit of postmodern cynicism would have been real helpful there. But, if postmodernism is the Antichrist or something, then you may not have that and just actually fall into the arms of the corporate power, like some conservative movements are. Anyway, so this is where postmodernism is really important. And this is where Derrida, again, and I'll give it to say, Derrida was not stupid. Derrida was very smart, and he understood the project of deconstruction as not merely you've got to make this. Paul Deman, there are differences between these thinkers, and Derrida was certainly, again, Derrida was very influenced by the idea, in my opinion, of Heidegger's clearing. He was very much trying to return to a basically apophatic thinking. We have the truth in painting, we have trace. Like he's kind of deconstructing rationality for a certain coming forth of things. Now, if we would like to argue that this was not clear enough or did not come out, we can always make those critiques. Basically every philosopher apparently gives rise to a totalitarianism at some point, it just seems to be what happens. But there's a really important idea that metamodernism is not saying postmodern, like this. The reason, again, oscillation is a problematic language is because it sounds like, modernism's bad, run to postmodernism's bad, run away. That then makes it sound like there isn't good in them. Metamodernism critically is braiding them as good together to create an effect that is only possible with them. So another problem with the language of oscillation, in my opinion, is it makes it sound like they're both boogeyman. Modernism is scary, postmodernism is scary, and we're running between them, and in our confusion, stumbled upon metamodernism. No, metamodernism is much more technical, it's much more intentional, and it's much more designed. It's a design way of thinking that's not scared, running from modernism and postmodernity, but aware that if we braid these together, we get and saturate it, we get a different effect. I'll pause there and give it to Sam. Sam, please.
Yeah. Okay, I was taking notes. So I'm just gonna try and yeah. So Michael, you were talking about metamodernistic therapy, and one thing that came to mind was I'm often the champion of Jung, I find in this circle. Um, one thing that was, this was so long ago that I read this, but in Man and His Symbol, he's going through various case studies of analysis, and one of the things he talks about in like interpreting dream contents is the fact that really important to the healing potential of the interpretation is actually this felt sense that the interpretation is correct. If you lack that felt sense, that intrinsic rightness of the metaphor or whatever, it actually is just like, well, you can argue all you want that is the most fitting interpretation as an analyst, but you're just not going to heal anybody. So it's like it's wrong, because the point here is to like get people to know themselves. And I mean, that being said, like what I really like about the work of all this cluster of thinkers that we're discussing today is there's like a collapse between knowing and being. So like and I mean that is inherent to this like like what you keep talking about, Daniel, about the effect. And I know that this is a good enough word for this conversation, but I feel like calling it an effect isn't really respecting the depth of what we're actually getting at, which is a kind of a collapse of like experience and like and knowing that is experiential, which is ontological. And like I think this is where like to sort of and frame this whole problem, it's like sorry, Michael, you had said that you kind of feel like there's this so what at the end of all of it, like why, like you can think of a metamodernistic therapy or whatever, but there's this overarching like why. I think that like this cluster of thinkers, they do a really good job of articulating a telos of being, which I would like to like coin, like attach to the word opportunity, like universal opportunity. And I mean, I find this a lot in architecture. Like as a student, I'm going through architecture school, and we're given all these styles, like okay, so we have the Greek temple, and we've got, then steel production, Eiffel Tower, and then, now we've got these weird wall assemblies with foam in the middle. I don't know. So there's all these, and you know capital A architecture when you see it, and you know things that are just buildings, and the whole faculty will hint at these things, but they can never really tell you explicitly why. And as a student who's just you're just a neophyte, you're like, okay, I want to design the best building ever. What's that look like? They can't tell you, and it's frustrating because they'll do a whole bunch of negating, right? And they'll point you to a bunch of case studies, but you have to like thread together like, okay, so what should I do here? Like there's a normative, there's a call for the normative. And I think what metamodernism really like grapples with is the fact that you can't really have a should because we are these like accretive, like we're an accretive, transjective, dynamic system of being, which is the universe trying to know itself. Hence the collapse of epistemological and the ontological. Like, like our felt knowing is the launch pad from which things can happen, and from which God, who is omniscient, has more and more things to know nonetheless. And so we're just, like we're in a process of freedom, and we have a telos of opportunity. It's like, and beauty, I think, as Thomas Jochen often discusses in very rigorous detail, is this like orienting force. It's the thing, it's the bridge into the material realm, where you have a handle on the current of truth and goodness. You can see it in beauty. That is orienting, but it's like, but towards what? And the what is like the vast moth swarm of potentiality, which is the future. Like it's like it could be towards any beauty. I don't know. It's like we're here, we're participating. There is no observation. There is only participation. Michael Levin often talks about how, you can't just like design experiments anymore where you have a hypothesis and then you expect to observe it. You have to have interventional experiments, hence why he, does all those xenobots. Like, it's not just that like he expects to observe something because he's cognizant that he's participatory. So he expects to like participate in a hypothesized manner. Yeah, so it's there. I think it really it depends a lot on information and meaning being circulated through the system. One thing I really like that Dempsey talks about is the idea that comes from Bobby, what's his name?
Azura,
Yeah,
Yeah.
that energy or information is energy. And that makes so much sense to the metamodernistic sensibility, because it's like, yes, when I hear that I got into this program or whatever, the energy surges through my organized physical being, right? And the whole thing makes me think of my beloved text, Taylor's The Language Animal. And he describes a semantic horizon, like, like there's this semantic horizon and you just have to keep going. And so it's not really that like metamodernism is any more progressed than modernism and postmodernism. It's just another settlement in the terrain of this semantic horizon that we're just trying to clear out and like get a map on. And in that whole, I guess like I've described a little situation, it's like, so what? What are we all doing here, like in this pursuit? If we say it's opportunity within this semantic horizon terrain thing, and we're just these accretive beings, participating in the transjective dynamic system, I think is so critical, and I really try and make this a cornerstone of the things that I write. Like you said, Daniel, it's so important not to be scared. And I know that is just like I can't prove that. I don't like I wouldn't even argue it. Like I wouldn't even try to, make a bulletproof argument for that. But I think it's like when like when you can evoke uh, a fearlessness in the face of all of this. I I think it's undeniable. Like there's something about if we are these processes which are a medium for the exchange of meaningful information, which grows this universe in a petri dish of, I don't know, like it's like being fearlessness is like the superconductive materiality of that exchange. It just gets everything flowing, and fear is it's like a insulator, like you 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 see that in people. Love, it doesn't flow with fear, like just doesn't.
Absolutely magnificent. No, fear is entropic, courage is negentropic, and basically that orientation of mind is of which then weds being and knowing in a manner that is energetic versus regressive. You said a lot there that was extremely important. I think you're correct that the word effect leaves a bit to be desired. Words like opportunity are better, and there's also a way in which it's invitational. Like when you experience a work that is meta-modern, it invites you into it to be part of it, and the invitation is also one that attracts you. You're like, of course I'll take it. Like it brings with it a certain care at the same time of the invitation, right? There's an energy that is created to accept the invitation, not to be, oh no, I'm sorry, I've got work, I'm busy or something. Like you'd like, no, I'd drop everything and be part of this, right? So there's an invitation that is, and it's an energy creating invitation as well. I think you said something from Bobby's work that is very important. So as you know, I've sometimes I'll say on that question of is math created or discovered, I like to say algebra is created, geometry is discovered. Likewise, I think information is basically created, energy is discovered. Information is simply a lower resolution form of energy that must necessarily be there for energy, but show me a universe in which there is information and not energy. Show me a universe in which there's algebra and not geometry. Like we assume that because there are lower resolutions, there's the possibility of there being a universe of that lower version without the higher version, but that actually doesn't necessarily follow. The lower version may simply, like, for example, show me a universe where there's atoms, but not things, to be crude, right? Like, I've never seen it, right? But we assume in that possibility, because things are made, quote unquote, out of atoms, supposedly, that therefore it must be theoretically possible for atoms to exist without being things. That's an assumption, actually, and that would be a ontological assumption that people hold that they don't realize they hold, right? Likewise, I mean, the closest thing you can get to information without energy is, say, in a computer, I suppose, which requires electricity to turn on. But please note, the computer comes into existence after the human being, not before. And of course, that John Seale mistake of saying the brain is like a computer. Well, the brain created a computer and then saw itself as such. Let us not forget that. Humans might be able to create things that make energy, quote unquote, separate from information. But that's simply because we have the energy / information to then create the split, right? But you need the whole to make the split. So basically, I think another, when I look at, dare I say, complexity science and many of these scientific movements that we are associated with forms of meta-modernism, there's obviously a strong resistance to reductionism. And obviously, Mr. Dempsey centers a lot of the world's problem with the whole part divide in his Burke emergentism, right? Like, there is the assumption that that divide even exists. And in Hegel, there is no, you can't, wholes are not made of parts. Things are always passing over into otherness. Everything is situation in Leibniz. Everything is always already connected, right? Basically, this is also quite important because there are other assumptions that we may have that we don't know we have. So for example, on the idea, I have no proof of this in any way whatsoever, but it just should be noted as an assumption on the idea that the universe will eventually have an entropic equilibrium and there will be a great heat death, right? It is, of course, extremely possible that the universe approaches equilibrium and never arrives, right? Because Negentropy, complexity, is a result of entropy actually negating itself. This is the key. There's this question of where does complexity come from? Like complex things. And Jim Rudd has a conversation, and the extraordinary, I'll think of his name in a moment. Oh my gosh, I love this man. It will come to me in a second. It's a moment, like I say, extraordinary, and it freezes up, and I love how that happens. But there's this, also Harold Mousewitz or other people like Stuart Kaufman, the great legendary Stuart Kaufman. That's actually an example where if you stop trying to think of the name, you know how you remember. That is an example that apprehension is more important than logos, actually, right? Like, why is it that you can suddenly have knowing when you stop trying? I always think those little moments are glimmers of actually the truth of knowing. That it's when you stop that you know, and simply logic is used for the unfolding of the things you apprehended, but if you try to make the logic replace the apprehension, you're dumb. You don't have anything to unfold, of course. Logic is best thought of as an unfolding of something that was not logically arrived at, but more so apprehended. And actually, Mr. Jockin, if you hear this, because we were going to get into, basically all of this to me is what Mr. Jockin has been bringing up on nous, N-O-U-S in Aristotle, which is basically the principle of life, which is this apprehension of beauty that is actually not merely understanding, but something deeper and, dare I say, more mysterious. But I think actually when we talk about this invitation, this apprehension, it is getting back to, you could say, is kind of at the very ground of Aristotle's thought, and arguably Plato's, as I understand it, but don't quote me, with this mysterious nous that is life, but it is life as an apprehensive sort of capacity at the same time. But to finish my point, complexity is a result of actually entropy accelerating. Entropy negates itself and creates negentropy. That's how you get negentropy, actually. It's where entropy, everything is in entropy. We know that, right? So there's this weird question of where does complexity come from, right? Well, it comes from entropy negating its own entropy, becoming more, it's an acceleration of entropy is what creates complexity, right? So the idea is that the acceleration of entropy is heading us quicker toward an equilibrium of a certain heat death or different things, right? But that's where it comes from. But of course, there's always the possibility, actually, that in the process of the negentropy, that the equilibrium might be something you always are heading toward but never arrive at, but had to have had the possibility of arriving at to have the negation of entropy to create complexity, right? There are all these kind of assumptions. Like there are assumptions in our thinking that we don't realize we have, where we say, well, this is where things are going, therefore it will eventually get there. Well, what if it's more geometrical, dare I say? What if it's actually you have to have a point that you're heading toward to have a point you don't arrive at, that you had to have had it there to not arrive at it to create the mechanism that allows the creation of negentropy, right? These are actually those kind of like, hey, did you see a metaphysical assumption there? Did you see that that was going on? We don't know. And the reason I say all of that is because the experience of energy, like it's this uplifting occurs, right? You don't experience it as a down, you experience it as an uplifting, right? Well, if that is occurring, if that is a mechanism that we know is there, that required a feeling of entropy, you had to have had entropy to have the possibility of that energy occurring. But why assume that the groundwork of the possibility of that energy is the ultimate destiny of things, is the ultimate fate? Like people like Lee Smolin is going on, it's like, dude, if time is fundamental, we shouldn't assume that you're ultimately going to have a heat death or stuff like that, right? There are just all these assumptions that we don't realize are there. That the energy, like that moment of energy, and I think that also is really important too, because I definitely think that metamodernism in dealing with the invitation is creating a certain energy, as opposed to that effect is sort of a testament. It's like, it becomes like, yes, this is the key. It's to the point you say, this is what it's ought to do. You actually do create an ought that isn't split and an is ought divide like Hume talks about, because being and knowing are together. And ought, there is an ethic that actually appears, but it is not an ethic of a top-down. It had to be designed. And it's also not oppressive because it's fundamentally relational. Here's the key. It's an ought that is an invitation. See, most oughts have been, you must conform to. The metamodern art that we are seeing, based on beauty and apprehension, is it's an ought, you ought to do that. It's an invitation. It's ought to be part of this, right? And you feel it as something you ought to be part of, not guilted into. Like this ought lacks guilt in an interesting way, because it is a certain beauty that pulls in. And that that's what you have going on. Like when you, like, again, you were speaking of the architecture classes, and this is good, and you have to kind of put it all together, but you're kind of lost and no one wants to say what it is. Modern literature, pose, they can all do this. This actually is giving you a heuristic by which to determine this works, this is correct, and it's not merely taste, because there is an effect there that is apprehended. And also too, like what you see the moment, like, yeah, metamodernism has emerged out of people looking big. Basically, their classes gave them a lot of case studies, and you had to somehow, as Leibniz would say, weave it together and figure, well, that's nous. That's the judgment, that's the apprehension Jockin is talking. Like, you apprehend the pattern and you find what is going on and you put it together. But then the problem is, we don't have, because the institutions aren't teaching this, they don't give you the check mark. They might actually make you feel bad, or like, what are you getting at, right? So then a lot of people, honestly, a lot of the artists although the metamodern theory is coming out of institutions, the metamodern art is not coming out of the workshops or the classrooms, because they're not the institutional logic, Olson incentives and stuff like that, right? But what's so critical, and then I'll give it to Michael here. What's so critical is that this experience of shine, affect, shine, invitation, Hegel's shine, nous, pattern, this then is fundamentally training the way of knowing that is not calculation logos based. And it is trusting it, and it is believing in it. And if you would like to have the human race not be basically replaced by AI capital logos calculation, then you need to really honor and train this capacity of nous and apprehension that is fundamentally human and based on Gestalt, right? So you really want art that is showing that is getting better at that, and that is modeling that, because then that modeling creates motivation to be like and to do. And so this cultural shift is very important, and it's just very important because it literally is able to create an experience of, that's right, that's how it ought to be, that isn't based on a Foucaultian norm. Thus, it is not going to be leading to the oppression we've always been concerned about, right? Because it is a glimmer of an invitation that's bringing him. I'll pause there, but give it to Michael. Michael, please.
Yeah, this is all really great. Yeah, just as a brief aside to your earlier point about forgetting the author and then remembering the author, and how, information is not apprehended. I had that experience today in church. There was this woman who, I haven't seen her for a while, but I've had multiple conversations with her, and this is like I've only been going to this church for like 2 months, so it's like relatively new. And I'm like, dang it, what's her name? Like, and I couldn't remember her name for the entire like coffee hour. And I spoke to her husband, I spoke to her son, and I was like afraid to talk to her. I mean, like, I don't know. I ended up just not having time anyways, but I was like, dang it, like, what's her name? And then I was meditating like an hour ago, and I was like, Barbara. Like, and not even thinking about it. Like, it wasn't on my mind, and it just was like, Barbara. But anyways, Sam, you were talking about participation. You were talking about participation, and like right before you said it, you're talking about like being in architecture school and like kind of wanting kind of a normative ideal of what it meant to like what like a good building, what like a sound piece of architecture looked like. And I just wrote like normative and therapy, like question mark, and then immediately wrote participation with like 3 exclamation points. And I think that's like, I mean, there's so many people now who are talking about this, John Vervaeke with like dialectic and dialogos, talking about participatory knowing, talking about, the transjectivity, which is a word you already use, the we space, all of these things. And, and then to your point, Daniel, about metamodern art being an invitation in, as opposed to, I kind of wrote down like, versus like it's almost like previous forms of art were almost like a demand. It was like here, like look at this like as a representation of this norm, this normative standard of my ideological kind of viewpoint. Whereas and what that does is it essentially like prevents the ability for that art to continue to evolve and transform. It's kind of like when the art is a finished product and when it's, you know, in the museum to be observed, it's like that is the end of that piece's life. Whereas the metamodern art is an open invitation to continuously through, you know, everyone's unique um, interior subjective connection to it, continue to shape it. And like, you know, I see even a space like the net being a continual art installation of sorts. Um, and and I'm reminded again of like last week, I think I made the or I asked the question like, um, you know, like something that I've just kind of been working through and I've been observing some other people from this little corner talking about, which is like the like so what of it all with these long form philosophical groups. You know, you log off and it's like people kind of have this energy to put these ideas into action in their communities and things, and you were kind of like I'm a little bit wary of um viewing these conversations as like a means to an end, and like the end being in the like hierarchical stack, like the end being the action. And so I need to stop asking this so what question, because you keep very wisely um shutting it down, not shutting it down, but like, you know, putting it in its place. But I think it's totally right. Like as soon as you kind of as soon as you kind of create some nicely packaged so what answer, that also then can be subject to exploitation, manipulation, collapsing this enterprise into some kind of like, yeah, some kind of like dogmatic thing. Um and what it seems like we're kind of like circling around is that metamodern art is, it like shows and not tells, is like cheesy as that old adage of art is. It's like it's through the experiential embodied uh feeling that you get as a result of interacting with it, you understand the why, as opposed to the why being like explicitly um revealed to you. Um and then in that way it's like you feel this very real sense of what the art is conveying. Um but like because it's embodied as opposed to intellectualized, and then I think this is where like, you know, maybe like the therapeutics come in, where it's like you get curious about why it is that you're feeling that felt sense. And you realize that it's not just one emotion that you're feeling, it's like this whole constellation of emotions that you're feeling. And that unlocks this whole complex web of of emotions that like can be brought forth to the round table of interlocutors or whatever. And then that art continues to live, because it's like if you're constantly curious about your own interior experience, it's like there's never not something there. There's never not something to um observe, to engage with, um as opposed to if you just read like something that's kind of explicating a certain viewpoint or a truth, it's like there isn't really much you can do with that. As opposed to, you know, reading I'm sure, you know, we've all read philosophical works that read like that. That's just like dictum after dictum after dictum, as opposed to a philosophical work that like invites you in to an experience, which is you can read those books as, you know, as long as you live and continue to get things out of it.
No, magnificent. Well, there's a few things. On the interiority that I think is just very interesting. Another characteristic of it is if I were to hold up an image or tell you about one of these powerful invitational moments in a metamodern work of art, you would go, so what? You know, I don't get it, right? It is only understood if you see the whole and you participate in it, right? So likewise, in my opinion, a good conversation should have a metamodern structure in the sense of you have to be there to get it and to experience it, right? So like the problem actually you could argue, like philosophy, like, well, I'll say the humanities, because I think this is true. The humanities are particularly doomed if they're not able to be metamodern in the way we are describing. Like, because people go, so what? Right? And like, because at the end of the day, it's like, okay, it's a really big, complicated novel called Infinite Jest. It's really neat, but will it get me a job? What will it do for me? Right? And you see, one of the things that ends up happening is, in some respects, and I just speak about literature because that's the main thing we write and study and you know, and different things like that for years, is that the problem is when you just have those works and they demand a lot, and I will definitely say that at the end of Infinite Jest, I did not necessarily get the emotional impact that other novels have given me or different things. And that, or for example, right? So what ends up happening is if you do all that work and you're not necessarily having that occur, and you also feel, here's the other problem, that this would require elaboration. I think metamodernism is basically, I'll just say, training nous or changing apprehension, right? A book like Infinite Jest, which I actually prefer the Pale King, but a book like Infinite Jest, and actually I prefer his essays, his nonfiction, I think is actually remarkable, like Up Simba, et cetera, so forth. But the problem is you actually have to use a whole lot of logos to understand Infinite Jest, which is the exact opposite of what we need to be trained in, actually, because logos leads to nihilism, boredom, dissection, and falling apart. And the tragedy of David Foster Wallace, which I will not put meat on these bones, but I'm happy to, is that I think David Foster Wallace knew there was a need for metamodernism. That's where his essay on New Sincerity occurred. His methodology for it in The Pale King was boredom. If we have a state of complete boredom, then the interiority has to come out because there's no external stimulation, okay? So Infinite Jest is all about entertainment, destroying you know, blah, 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 right? So The Pale King is about, well, maybe boredom will save us then, right? So there's a gesture, and Dimber says that David Foster Wallace was the Moses who never entered into the metamodern promised land, okay? And for me, what's fascinating, though, is I do think in The Pale King, David Foster Wallace genuinely tried to enter the promised land. The issue is the following: you can never get to you can't get there through boredom because boredom numbs the interiority into which you are inviting people, right? So boredom won't do it. It is a removal of external stimulation that you would say, well, wouldn't that bring out the subject? And he has considerable paragraphs on how you can only be heroic in boredom. So is this emphasis on the heroic, working at the IRS and stuff like this. But the problem is boredom is not having nothing to do. It's losing the capacity to see significance of what you could do, right? It's not having nothing to do. It's a loss of an internal capacity, right? And Patricia Sachs's literary analysis on boredom is fascinating. You can't get to the invitation through boredom, even if David Foster Wallace saw its necessity. You have to do it through a total saturation, which is like there's nothing external, but it's through a fullness. It's lack, not nothing. You know, nothing is boredom. Lack, as we've said with Jockin, is, you know, there's blindness from privation, your muscles broken, and then there's blindness from an excess of light, right? Like what ends up happening in a metamodern work, it's an excess that creates a saturation that resists categorization, but in that fullness, there's something that breaks forth. Whereas in boredom, there's a nothing, so you can't have a phase transition, per se. You to get a phase transition, to get an invitation, there has to be a saturation. Lack and nothing are isomorphic. They seem the same, but they are not the same. So the Pale King is nothing, whereas metamodern is, dare I say, lack, ergo apathetic, right? So that's kind of that would be an argument that I would make on David Foster Wallace as the Pale King as a certain effort, but not quite getting there. But this actually is a revelation then, because if one wants to talk about metamodern therapy, metamodern architecture, et cetera, so forth, one has to have a certain logic of saturation, a certain logic of always heading one off like a game of mental chess to keep you in to keep you in that place. So for example, off metamodern architecture, not that I'm an architect or any of this is correct, would have some sort of perhaps oscillation. Denver will talk about, say, the tiny and the epic. So you could imagine an architecture that has small doors that lead into a large room that then is also oscillating between play and celestial, almost like playful and celestial, right? And the key is someone who is in this building would not know if it was serious or not. Is this a joke or not? Because it's like a small door and it's difficult to get through. And then when I get through it, it's like this very expansive space, right? That what it would eventually do is actually that inability to tell if the architecture took itself seriously or was creating a playground would actually increase the probability of your openness to the vastness of the glass ceiling or something. It would like make you actually see the room, dang it. Like that would be a key characteristic, in my opinion, if I'm speaking based on the stuff that Denver talks about, is that metamodern architecture would be one that makes you actually feel the room. You know, when people talk about working the room or feeling or like kind of working the room, it would be an architecture that would, in of its very architecture, make you work the room in its experience of it. Right. And so there would be some sort of movement between, say, the tiny or the epic, the playful, like a door that can be only opened by 3 people, for example. Like there has to be 3 different people. One does the handle here, one over there. So it would make you meet strangers, right? Like you would meet people, right? And so it would be playful, but then it would be serious because you would open the door and the first book on the bookcase in front of you would be the friend session book, for example. So you would open it and you would have in front of you the books on the bookcase would be the ones about how nobody has friends anymore. And so you would see this playful gimmick was actually a sort of like, hey, we actually need one another, right? So what would be very important, again, just based on a metamodern architecture would have some sort of, hey, let's not just show people how crazy, let's not just, because the modernist novel is full of its own techniques. Like it wants to show you, I know a lot of tricky techniques. I know a lot of fancy things, right? And basically, a lot of people in the humanities who feel small under STEM and rejected by STEM are then like, I'll show you, I can come up with a lot of fancy techniques and do crazy stuff, right? But the problem is, if it comes from that place, it may not be able to create a saturation because the techniques are not designed in such a way to lead to something meaningful, right? That's another, like there is something like Sam was saying, there's a teleological, there's an invitation. It's like an invitational telos. Like this is leading you to a certain invitation, right? So you're using your techniques to bring you to that experience, not simply to make you go, wow, that person's creative. That's another way to look at it. Like a lot of modernists is like, wow, that person has a lot of ingenuity. Wow, they're very creative. But you're looking at the author. That's another way to look at it. Like a lot of the modernist, you could say, is making you look at the genius, right? Whereas a good work that was more metamodern would actually make you look at one another or at yourself or at the relation, and then the author maybe, then the creator, right? But then the postmodern's like, well, there's no author at all, death of the author. But the problem with that is, no, someone has to design this, the author, and it takes a certain level of skill. So the metamodern also is a certain redemption of the author, quote unquote, based on that, Roland Barthes sort of essay and different things. But this is author as designer for your sake, not for their genius, right? It's like author as designer for your sake in the experience of this invitation, not for their own genius. The last thing I'll say, and then give it to Sam. It's a tricky thing with the so what question, because if you say so what, then you're in the logic of modernism, utility, so on and so forth. And basically you're saying none of this has value unless it does something. Well, that's the modernist logic, of course, right? You've actually fallen into that trap. Also, too, just as a quick, certainly conversations like this are for friendship. They are certainly for, one of the key things like people underestimate is how difficult it is to keep up with people, right? Like if you don't, like drifting is a big thing in adult. Oh, we'll have dinner next week. And that person at church, you said you'd have dinner, you never have that dinner, or you have it once and then never again. It is incredibly difficult not to drift. And actually, if all the conversations did was create friendship, that is a massive deal, because people's emotional and mental state is massively impacted by a lack of connection, a lack of friendship, and a lack of deep engagement, of which your lack of that would impact the quality of work you do and all the other stuff. So, conversations like this, if they're not something that necessarily lead to a clear utility, they actually strengthen the horizon by which you do all things, actually. And so there's a way in which there's a saturation of whatness in that too. I also think they train you in beauty. I also critically think conversations like this train you in the capacity to apprehend nous in what we've been saying. Like this ability to apprehend something you've never thought about, or to see a pattern, or to connect, or to respond. Like if what we are getting at is that human intellect, humanity, is primarily more about this very mysterious apprehensive capacity, then whatever trains that would be really important to do regularly and often. And if Taylor's right about the semantic, and if language and all of that is a really big deal, then it probably involves language. It probably involves a poetic use of language. It probably involves language that doesn't know its end ahead of time, but apprehends its process as it's going. And language is basically seemingly the very isomorphic structure in human events and activity of a universe learning itself. Because what do we do when we speak? We learn ourselves. Like you have to speak to other people to know what you think. Like, right? Like you think in the like it is isomorphic in its relationality with what the universe, following a Dempsey, is doing, right? And so let's put it this way, if that is what the universe does, then this is the thing that all what's lead to. Like all utility is actually, in a way, leading to something like this, which is the process of active learning and meaning making at the very edge of the now, that doesn't know what's coming next, the limit of omniscience, that is then finding another and another, ever apprehending per se, according to the nous. That is the thing that everything is doing. And so whatever is like that is not something that leads to something else, because what could it lead to that was beyond the very thing the universe is to do, per se, right? So if it led to something else, that would actually be a problem. The very fact that it does not suggests that it is actually participating in the very thing we're saying participation is needed in. And so so those are things that come to mind with the so up. The friendship, the beauty, the apprehension of the nous, and the participation of the things we just said. But let me pass it to Sam here. Sam, please.
Yeah, just to go on that, like, if we add like other, because part of this is tied to a certain theory of everything, right? Like all of these things, and I'm currently reading Irreducible by Federico Fagin, and you know what? Just found it on a whim and was like, okay, I could get with this. And one thing that he, in the front part of the book is basically like a brief history of science, right? And especially focusing on transition between like 1899 and present day physics. And like one of the, if we add like, so just taking everything you just said and then like adding to it the discovery of chaotic systems in the 70s, like, and their behavior, which is that when like like the progress of a system, it really relies very heavily on very small interventions. Well, the initial state, and then thereafter you've got this chaotic blooming, which entails butterfly wings flapping its wings, having tornado effects on the other side of the planet. And then another part of Fagin's argument is that like is that like subject consciousness is paramount. So it's like, yeah, if like I think in this like in this imaginative map that we're coming to right now, it's like, okay, yeah, you've got one being in despair in a system, like that could be a terrible butterfly, and so to keep people together and to like combat isolation and to keep recognition between two sentient beings like flowing. Like that's just like it's ontologically significant. And it's just who really, there's no control to the universe. So who could ever say, like that things don't completely fall apart when we're despairing? But honestly, it does seem like things do completely fall apart just because of despair. I listened to the audiobook of J.D. Vance's, just because it's, topical with the election, J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy. I mean, I came from actually like, my family they're loyalists. So there was one point where we were Americans and then headed north. But like I share a very common cultural heritage with J.D. Vance, which is to say I'm a hillbilly. But like yeah, like it's a sweet little portrait of a community, and I think he does a really nice job of just like bringing forward the importance of just the interiority of all of the all of the members of his family, all of his neighbors, and him and himself, that I really like, frankly. And that's a really like a very in situ tale of of this butterfly effect, um, and this chaotic system. And I kind of wanted to introduce, maybe just as a topic to riff on further, to this, two things. One, Paul Conti, he is I found him on like Huberman Lab, and he's just got this interesting schema of subjectivity or like personhood. Like he has he has a system of thinking about how consciousness relates to on the unconscious, and like and he's used that schema to like to treat his patients. And I mean, I briefly looked at it, but one thing that really struck me about this, and it just felt like it felt really brilliant to me, was that for him, he knows that his patients are sort of like succeeding, flourishing, um, when he can identify them as both um, agentic and gracious. So it's this agency and gratitude are these really integral, like are the integral columns of personhood. And I don't know like how this relates, because we're saying like, okay, like there is this uh ontological invitation to the future that we're all experiencing. I just and often we reduce it to the functioning, and maybe that's like maybe that's showing that the that's a symptom of like the agency column being a little bit too load bearing, when there's like it seems like gratitude is something. I don't know, pairing them together felt really interesting to me, I guess is what I would like to say, and also invite you guys to speak on. The second thing that I would like to sort of add to the conversation is, okay, so energy is information, and we live in this participatory world, and also one in which, there's like chaotic systems everywhere, small interventions have outside effects, blah, blah, blah. I can't, like, I literally, I'm like, the whole time that I'm listening to any of these discussions, I'm just like, guys, there are whole cultures of peoples who have been trying to commune with spirit worlds, like, and have meaningful conversation, including our own. Like, we have mathematicians receiving theorems from angels. Like, why is nobody talking about this? Like it's like, like we're trying to, I think that metamodernism and these theories of everything that take consciousness as primary, they do a really great job of acknowledging peak religious experiences as something real, and they take that seriously. But I feel like I want to like kind of like have a postmodernist jab at the whole thing and be like often sometimes Michael Levin in his talks he'll say like are weather systems trainable? Are they sentient? What is their status as entities? Um, like guess we won't know until we run an experiment wherein we try and train a weather system. Well, it's like, okay, like to be crude, what about rain dances? Like I don't know, like there's a whole world out there of completely different models of relating to this system that seems to really already be pretty um accurately grasped by other people's, and like in its participatory nature, like all of the Cartesian traps are avoided by a lot of other people. Um, so yeah, just the gratitude agency pillars and animism and cross-cultural um, concepts is what I kind of wanted to inject into this.
Oh no, I mean magnificent. I mean the problem is basically nothing. If it's not predictable reliably, it's not real. And you see, the most important things in life are not reliably predictable, actually. And so if you cut out as worth thinking about that of which cannot reliably and predictably give you the results that are quantifiable, then don't be surprised if, well, that fundamentally, that just, well, assumptions matter. That assumption cuts out a very large percentage of civilizations on planet Earth and history and thought and lame deer and different people like this, right? So that you get into a lot of trouble, right? I mean, another topic that's fascinating is that French UFOist, Jacques guy, whose name talking about the history of actually UFO sightings are way more common in human civilization than are realized. And actually, they tend to take the mysterious thing is they tend to appear relative to the time page that they're in, right? UFOs in the 1880s look like air balloons, right? In the 1950s, they look like discs. In the Japan in the 800, they look like orbs, right? Or different moves. Like there's entire topics that have to be considered and thought about that I think will be thought about. But this is what I would also say. The question becomes, what are the skills of thinking needed for taking on these kind of thinking? And I think the ability of recognizing the relation, the apprehension, the nous, the beauty, the flow, the invitation, right? Like a conversation about, say, Aboriginal, like culture, UFOs, Aboriginal, that is not invitational, but is actually saying, we're the in crowd, we have the special knowledge and you do not. That also becomes very problematic. And I actually do think you are, like you mentioned, the theory of, theories of everything, obviously Kirk's channel. I mean, I think this technology actually affords the social coordination mechanism of YouTube and Zoom actually allows us to go into topics that perhaps in the past were too easy to get lost in or manipulated regarding, that actually people can generatively explore and do it in a group of people that can like almost function as the thread going into the labyrinth so you don't get lost. I think we're in an age of really everything is on the table, but we need to go in together, right? To really kind of think about that. And I think there are many topics that actually are going to be taken on that could be thought in these different ways with that golden thread. And I think, like you're saying, well, there's kind of just the idea that if it is true, it will come back around, right? If there's truth to it, it will come back around. It may take a long time, but eventually that will come out, right? And there is this, like you're saying, animalism, there are many cultures that have not had a subject-object divide because the subject-object divide is fundamentally a product of logos. It has to be, because it has to be a product of division. In apprehension, you do not experience the object hiding itself. In apprehension and beauty, you experience the thing giving itself to you, right? Like when you really learn how to train animals, you don't experience the animal, the cow or the dog or different things on the farm. You don't experience the animals as that which you cannot communicate with. You actually learn a kind of silent language. You learn a way of coordination that does not suggest a subject-object divide or popular Kantianism. But you see, the problem is, if logos is the metric to which all things must prove themselves to be accepted, then the starting metric sets the board in such a way that ways of doing things that are more, dare I say, Western or just Enlightenment heavy, however we want to put it, win by default because of the board, right? Because of how things are set. Now, of course, the Enlightenment emerges from religious wars, manipulation, conspiracy. So there's a danger on the other side of the road. But you see, this is where the relationality and honestly the ability to think on many layers at once, philosophically, et cetera, so forth, emotionally become extremely important. I think so. A few more things. I think I will also say, well, a lot of the reasons why people want to know, so what? Like, what's the point? Is actually fear. They're afraid they're wasting time. And we've said earlier that fear is what basically kills everything. It is, again, this is a very giant claim, but I don't know if, regardless the difference in metaphysics or ideas of God or afterlife or whatever, you know, I don't know of any wisdom tradition or religion that doesn't really say fear is bad. Fear is really bad. Like fear is like the worst, actually. Honestly, we've spoken about this before. When you start talking about faith, say in Christianity, that word makes a whole lot more sense when you understand it means faithful, which means courage. Like the problem is people are like, oh, Christianity is about faith in Jesus or something, right? The problem is faith now is a word that means belief. You have the belief in it, like you believe the Apostles' Creed or something, right? Not necessarily saying that's entirely wrong, but the word faith, and N.T. Wright is big on this, and I think he's 100% correct. The word faith in Romans is absolutely tied to the idea of service, and it means, like, when you have faith in someone, that means you trust them, that means you're courageous for them, and you have faith that the thing will come through. The word faith the word faith is a courage word. And the word faith makes a whole lot more sense as, dare I say, a virtue or something religion should honor when you think about it as freaking courage, not belief, like a belief system, right? A belief system has gotten us in trouble. Faith is about courage. The word faith means faithful. And then also, without getting into the theological weeds, if we understand that faith means faithful, courage, then when you ask a question, can you be saved by works? And someone like Luther says you can't. Well, but you see, here's the trick. Courage is a work. Like that problem kind of goes away in a way, right? Because when you ask, well, what are you saying? I can have faith in Jesus, for example, and not do any good things, right? Like that seems like a problem because then on my deathbed I could ask for faith, and there's all that problems and stuff like that. But if faith is fundamentally courage, then then there's always going to be a work. But funny enough, sometimes, but it's not a work that is easily quantifiable according to a religious schema that can lead to manipulation and like, oh, I'm a better Christian than other people, because your courage is your courage. Your demons are your demons. There is work you need to do on yourself to overcome your timidness, right? Faith is the work of overcoming your fear, right? So the good works faith debate collapses into you doing the work to face your fears, right? And so I definitely think that fear basically is death. Fear is like, I mean, also too, like there is a way in which, and this would have to be elaborated on. I'm not sure if the biggest challenge I think the fear of death is one step on the road to overcoming the fear of fear, dare I say. Like the fear of death is not like overcoming death actually requires overcoming fear. And there are many people that I think there are actually a number of people who get to the point where they're no longer afraid of dying anymore, maybe simply because they don't see beauty, but they can overcome the fear of death, but they actually still don't overcome various fears that are keeping them locked in a bad job or keeping them in a bad situation or whatever, right? So I think it's really important to emphasize courage, which of course courage will entail overcoming the fear of death, but is not simply the overcoming of the fear of death. It's a much more expansive thing, right? Like honestly, well, you could argue that wherever there's fear, there's actually a fear of death because there's a fear of ego death or occupational death. So you can make that move, and that's fine. But I think emphasizing courage is extremely important. And I think Well, and like you're just saying as well, these small little butterfly, and I'll give it to Michael, these small little butterfly effects. I mean, it just should also be noted. I always go back in economics to the solo residual, which basically shows that um, we have no idea where 50% of wealth comes from. Like, no idea. It's, once you go through liquidity, productivity, there's like 50% left. We're like, it's kind of mysterious, right? I would strongly suggest that 50% is these small little butterflies where people face their fears or they form gratitude that create motivation that generates that mysterious that can't be calculated or quantified by liquidity flows or supply and demand curves, aggregate demand, et cetera, so forth, right? The solo residual should be for me, is a giant revelation of what's going on. And you mentioned hillbilly elegy. Yeah, exactly. When people lose hope or gloom, then it's bad. It's really bad. And whatever maintains the relationality to help people not fall into that gloom. I mean, that book that won 2000, I can't remember the name, that won the Nobel Prize in economics. I mean, look, there's more and more people that are saying, hey, economics really depends on social institution and social capital and all that stuff we can't quantify in terms of economics. Turns out economics really needs it. Huh. Well, I guess this is where economics shouldn't have kind of gotten over, should have left it apathetic, should have left that interiority alone and said, justify yourself. So what? What's the point of forming these potlucks? What productivity are these potlucks going to do? So people stop doing the potlucks, they stop doing the conversations, and then freaking economic welfare went down a cliff, right? That's an example where economics did not honor something that was supposed to be, dare I say, apathetic. It wanted the apathetic to justify itself. It made it apathetic and died. And so, like, that's a sad story and is continually the case. But you see, the problem is economics actually is inefficient. Exactly. Make America have potlucks again, 100%. Economics actually becomes weirdly, economics becomes inefficient if it doesn't allow things it thinks are inefficient. Like, the inefficiencies are actually the secret to the wealth, right? Because the inefficiencies actually are secret complexities. What we call inefficient are usually just the things we can't quantify as efficient because they create more than mere efficiency. They create higher forms of wealth in human activity that can't be boiled down to efficient. So we say it's inefficient. No, it's more so non-efficient, like non-rational, as I always like to do. It's not reducible to a single metric because it entails that as well. And if you force the thing to justify, it loses itself. It dies, right? And you could say that's happened to the universe as a whole and having to justify itself into models as opposed to treating it as an open system that is its own unfolding complexity. Well, basically, in standard models, that possibility of the universe simply was not allowed. It wasn't even a possibility because of the model that we had preset. Right. So likewise, our ideas of utility and pragmatism basically have not allowed cities to not become or towns to not become like hillbilly elegy. We've not allowed people to maintain ways of life for their well-being because we have defined that outside the parameter of what is rational and productive to do. Which leads to a lot of trouble. There's some very important things to say on the agency gratitude point. I will give it to Michael, but that's really actually a big thing. I really think that's important, but let me give it to Michael. Michael.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's a great segue because that's kind of what I really wanted to touch on. So, our telos is building, and we don't even have to we finish each other's ideas. Um, One thing that I was thinking of, like, why that, because I'm also struck by that combination, like agency and gratitude. Why potentially that's like a really potent combination for personhood is that, and you know, totally like totally open to this being critiqued or like not helpful, but I was thinking that they're kind of like a masculine and feminine um uh, kind of like energy that is like kind of a really rich combination where you have the agency that is kind of forward moving, that's like kind of in search of something, kind of a very active, like kind of an active positive energy. And then you have the gratitude that's this kind of open reset, like receptive, like kind of awe and wonder. Like I think gratitude and awe and wonder are like inextricably kind of bound up with each other. Um, and like I'm just thinking at like times in my life when I have both, it's like it's kind of hard to have both. Like in moments when I'm really grateful, like I can very easily kind of have this experience of like unity and oneness, but like I'm kind of like losing myself in the process where I kind of just like want to like bask in the sun of like creation or beauty or whatever. And then I kind of lose my like own agency and then like contrary to that, when I feel really like, agential and like, very I don't know, just like there's this like eros that's like pulling me into something, or if I'm like really active or busy or whatever, like it can be hard to like kind of just take a beat and like actually be grateful. Um, so like when those come together, and I'd be interested to to explore more like maybe how to create the conditions for those to arise, like co-arise together. But like when they do it, it does feel like this kind of like holding of a tension point um between these two. I don't want to say oppositional energies because it doesn't feel like they like work against each other, but like they they feel very different for me. Um, and so, yeah, that's really interesting. And then the other thing that I wanted to just touch on was Sam, you talking about like these like animistic practices and rituals, um, that kind of uh provoke these like kind of anomalous spiritual experiences, like communing with the dead or spirits or other entities. Um, I'm actually in one of my classes right now. I'm in a transpersonal theory and literature class, and so we're talking about like near-death experiences, anomalous experiences, mediumship, like communing, having people like commune with dead family members and things like that. And I actually did my undergrad thesis on near-death experiences, and as part of researching for that, I read this book called After, and it's written by like who many consider the foremost researcher of near-death experiences. Um, and he has a section in his book where he's kind of refuting like common like kind of responses to kind of diminish near-death experiences by like the scientific establishment. And like one of them was like you can't base scientific inquiry off of testimonials, off of like personal accounts. Like it has to be, like scientific, objective scientific phenomena that's studied as opposed to like, subjective experience. And he basically made the point that like there like nothing can become empirically based without subjective testimonial. Like that is like actually how science starts, is like someone observes something and they give their account, and then other people observe the same thing, and then it becomes like like a legitimate thing. um and so like just kind of on that point of like people poo-pooing like all these like rain dances, for example, or whatever. It's like if whole cultures are having the same experience, it's like, well, you kind of got to take it seriously. Like at some point you got to take it seriously. um whether or not you from your theological standpoint or ontological standpoint, like you agree with it, or you think it's like the right way at getting to God or communing with God, is like a different kind of discussion. But like the fact of it being like a legitimate thing, purely on the basis of it like being kind of woo, I feel like is yeah, is kind of like missing the mark a little bit. Um, yeah. Yeah, just the last thing before I pass it back. You were talking about Daniel, how people can overcome the fear of death, but still that not translate to overcoming other fears in life. For this class that I mentioned, we had to watch this movie Fearless. I don't know if you've watched it. It was like a movie in the 90s that came out starring Jeff Bridges, and he has this near-death experiences on a plane as it's crashing, and he basically kind of like his fear dissolves, like his fear of dying dissolves because he survives this thing, and he's like transported to this realm where he saves like half the plane because he gets in contact with God, and while everyone else is panicking, he's able to kind of like shepherd them to safety. But it's really interesting because like he basically thinks he's invincible after that, and he's like assuring everyone like, you'll be safe with me. And he kind of has this like God savior complex thing, but he's also like super distant from like everyone in his life, and like he's like kind of nihilistic, and like at the end, like he has another near-death experience on purpose. He eats a strawberry, which he knows he's allergic to, because he wants his wife to save him, because he realizes that like the only way for their relationship to be restored is if he like reverses the roles, where like he opens himself up to like his own vulnerability, and she comes in and like yeah, 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 very big Socrates energy, totally. Um, so I just thought that was like a super, and I did like a whole paper on it, and I just thought it was like a super interesting movie that like exactly typifies that point of you can you can like have a contact with death and die and come back, and like you have no fear of dying. But like what so many people who have near-death experiences report is they don't want to come back to the earthly realm because this godly realm is so beautiful, and they either get like forced back, or they realize that there's something in their life worth living for. And I think for him, he didn't want to be back on earth, and that's why he was really cynical of like this kind of human world that's so much uglier and less beautiful than the godly world. And it's like, yeah, you can overcome the biggest fear that we all have, and yet the fear of living, and the fear of being in relationship, and the fear of like dealing with relational strife and conflict and pain and suffering and jealousy, envy, whatever, um, can still be present. And that's like yeah, like I sometimes think like, are the people who like free solo Yosemite, like are they just like the wisest people on earth because like they don't have this fear of death? And it's like Alex Honnold in that movie, like Free Solo. It's like there was a moment where they asked him like, what do you value more, like your climbing career or your girlfriend? And he's like, I would much rather free solo Yosemite than like hang out with my girlfriend. And I'm like, oh God. But yeah, no, he's also like super cool. But I think there's like, yeah, like there's overcoming fear is a really interesting one, because it can often feel like a two-headed snake, where it's like you overcome one fear and just two more grow, like as you journey into more and more risk taking, more and more fears seem to present themselves that you have to kind of wrestle with. And I guess that's his life. But you you learn with each one how to tolerate, like what you can, like how to tolerate, how to at just a meta level, and then like what you can tolerate more specifically. But yeah, I'll pass it back.
Magnificent. No, that's very important. And Javier Rivera has been having tremendous talks with Luber and Jock, and we've actually brought up Noose quite a few times. And I think actually there's what was just said was quite important. Absolutely. People can avoid facing fears by doing something that looks like facing fears. For example, if people are afraid of their family life, they can go and do something scary, or facing fears like skiing down a hill or free soloing or different things. We can use things that look like facing fear to hide from fear, right? And this is where there's a certain knowledge, know thyself. I actually think that the idea of know thyself, which of course can be problematic, if we actually just focus on fear, where you like know thyself in terms of fear, not knowledge, not definition and who you are, but what are you afraid of? That idea is much more useful. Introspection should actually, in my opinion, primarily be about identifying fears. And when you're actually convincing yourself you're facing fears when you're not, then it is ideas or self-definition or some sort of internal enlightenment, right? Introspection. Well, there's an argument to be made that focus, breaking things into parts, is actually a necessary ability to root out the virus of fear, not to get to what a thing is. Like if we didn't have the ability to break things down or to go inside things or treat them like atoms, if there was an infection in it, we couldn't find it and bring it out. But we made a mistake. We use that capacity to heal things in their entirety from things like fear or disorder. We treated that as the means of knowing it, when that is actually simply the means of getting it back to its healthy gestalt, I almost want to say. So there's also something to be said about the out-of-body experience, and I'll give it to Mr. Rivera. There's an interesting idea where, again, I'll just use Christianity as an example, where an out-of-body experience would actually be a temptation or a false heaven, or actually a very problematic thing, because it's supposed to be the resurrection of the body, actually. And heaven, you could say that heaven must be embodied or in the body, or else there's something problematic about it. And I think actually the gloom it can cause, because there's something also about confusing heaven or salvation with dreams that is problematic. Because dreams, I think there's something about the brain, this has to be elaborated on in Belonging Again too. I think there's something about the brain that subconsciously wants to treat all determinations like a dream, because then that means I have control over everything, actually, right? And since thought, naturally, I don't think you can draw a hard distinction between thought and dreaming, actually. It's just when you're asleep. Like thought is always trying to world. It's just when you're awake, it runs into determination, but it would love to actually be free of determination and just be able to create things in world however it likes, right? And actually to be all powerful. There's actually an odd temptation in dreams if they're not rightly ordered, in the same way that there's a temptation in the out-of-body experience, right? But the out-of-body experience is precisely the capacity the body contains, of which affords the potential of nous and beauty and gratitude and flow and getting lost in the other. The very capacities of dream and what makes possible the supreme out-of-body, because what happens in a flow conversation? What happens, like out-of-bodiness is the experience of the most, I'm sure free soloing is an out-of-body experience, right? Like that very ability to be out of body and to experience out of body is actually like the moment of the highest testament of the ontology of relation. Like when you feel out of body, the problem with that language, out of body, is it's too negative. Out of body is in relation. That's what it means. Like out of body is when you're in relation with the entirety. Like people talk about, I'm one with the universe, I'm one with the world, I'm not, the ego dies. Out of body is in relation, right? So it's like so there's a certain entireness that is experienced, right? But you see what's very interesting, dare I say, from a Christian metaphysic, it would say, well, actually, you're not one with everything if you're out of body, because you left the body behind, right? So the problem is you can only be one of everything if you bring your body with you, but that experience of the out of body actually is necessarily leaving that behind. So the trick is the following. The human has to learn somehow to, one, experience themselves as part of everything, and I call that self-forgetfulness, with the body, which is in which you can have the experience of nous and beauty. And this is where we get into what is the being of the human in actuality, time, space. Jochen and Lou were talking about, but Michael, please.
No, I just wanted to jump in really quick and kind of ask a clarifying question. This is something that I was discussing with a friend yesterday. These experiences of like union, this oneness, where people talk about like the ego dissolving and things. Are you really in relation in that experience? Because is there isn't there a loss of the kind of dualism of me in relation with the world? It hasn't the agent arena kind of collapsed.
But you see,
And then yeah, no, go ahead.
no, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just going to say, but this is getting at why Noose must be trained because these extremely fine distinctions are huge. Like they're not necessarily all the same, even if they're tastes of steps along the way. Ego death could be a step along the way to create the energy and the motivation to then work into in relation and flow, and that could lead you to then beauty. These are steps potentially, right? Like these are all similar and they have qualities, but if you don't have Nous and you can't apprehend these distinctions and then ask, what is the human? What is actuality by which we better align? You wouldn't know which of these experiences to align with or to practice and train yourself toward, right? Like if the human is precisely a being of which is supposed to participate in, say, a growing complexity or an apprehension of beauty, then that must entail, like, it could be the case that the very conditions that allow that possibility also allow the possibility of the experience of ego death, which could make it seem like the ego death is the right way to use those internal possibilities of the human being, but actually it's supposed to be ego death in the experience of beauty, right? Like this is where whatever the ontological affordances are that allow, say, the experience of beauty, they may entail, say, 22 possible experiences that must require all the other possibilities to allow any of the possibilities, and one of them may be the highest fittingness of the human being. You see what I'm saying, right? This is where it is very tricky, where all of this could be exploration of, well, let's try the ego death method. And we went through history. Like, think about Hegel's, like, the history. Like, all of these could be, we tried the out of body. Did that work well? That had unintentional consequences. We tried the ego death. Well, that had unintentional consequences. We tried kind of ideas of reincarnation. I did a lot of work on Hinduism, but that had unintentional consequences of caste systems and leaving people behind. Like, there's a certain historical logic that could be working on this kind of deeper metaphysical idea that all cards on the table, it's like, well, we see something going on with animalism. We see something going on with reindeer. There's an organization of these principles, and there's a certain experimentation, basically, or going through or participation that's getting at all of these things that is trying to figure out which best aligns with what the human is, which gets us to the lovely metaphysics, Aristotle, Heidegger, fun question that they were having the other day. But and I know Jock and Javier is next, but this is extremely important. Like there are these kind of experience. Actually, this is really important. I almost forgot to say this. One of the key ideas of metamodernism is even if you don't know what's true, you know the person had that experience and it was real for them. So likewise, the reason why this is very important, because like Tobe, as a metamodern writer, he's talking about growing up in a Pentecostal family, well, not Pentecostal, but Mormon, and also Pentecostal families, this idea that they had really meaningful emotional experiences. And before metamodernism, they were led to feel that, well, if that was all a lie, then those emotional experiences were lies too, right? They didn't happen. Metamodernism lets you say, well, even if those things didn't happen, I don't know. I know they were meaningful for me, that they were real experiences, and that is real. This is really important because if I wanted to talk about, dare I say, almost a metamodern anthropology of a kind, you would say, I don't know if rain dancing actually works, but I know these people believe it, and it's real for them. Why? What's going on? I don't know if Pentecostalism is true, but it's real for them. Why? The reason why this is very important is because what we've done is said, well, if the rain dancing or the Pentecostalism didn't actually occur, then there's nothing to see here. There's nothing to investigate here. So you brush them off the table, right? Well, metamodernism, and as Denver is describing, comes along and says you can't actually make that move because there is something real there that you have to take seriously, right? And you have to think about what must the conditions of reality be like so that these people could have an experience that they genuinely believe is real. Like you still have to answer that. Like on the out-of-body experience, right? It is 100% clear that there are many, many people that genuinely believe they had an out-of-body experience. And even if you say it was false and it didn't actually happen, you still have to explain how the reality is such that it can give people experiences like that they genuinely believe are real. You still have to explain that and how that is in the cards. But if you just simply say, well, it's all false, then you don't do that work. And that seems to be really necessary now for kind of sorting through these certain metaphysical experiences that people have that seem to be tied to some sort of conditionality humans entail, that if we don't reclaim and train, then we're not going to be getting back at nous, not getting back at things like beauty and stuff like that. So I think that then leads to, well, for me, and then I'll give it to Javier, and there's something really, this all ties to the agency gratitude thing that's really important. But this also gets into like when Aristotle's asking a question, what is the thing and what is the telos and like ontology, what's very interesting, what is being suggested here is that asking what is the human, by which you would then determine what is fitting for the human, must take into account these metaphysical experiences, not merely the rational functionality of logos, not merely biological needs, not merely instinctual appetites. Those are all part of the stack. But actually, the very fact that humans can have these kind of experiences must be in the cards of defining what the human is, by which to then determine what is fitting for the human in terms of teleology, right? And this is why I keep saying, like, there's this interesting idea, again, like, do we believe the body is necessarily part of whatever is most fitting for the human being? Because if you say that, do you believe every part? Here's another way to put it. Do we believe every dimension of the human, including the ego in some way, is actually necessary for the human to be what they actually are, and therefore to determine what is most fitting for them? If the answer is yes, which, you know, if we take a Christian idea that everything God created is good, if in the right order, as Augustine said, then everything that the human entails is actually supposed to, quote unquote, be there for the human to be themselves. So there is no dimension of the human that can be removed without destroying its teleological potential, dare I say. So emotions have to be kept. The body has to be kept. The logos has to be kept. The imaginative faculties have to be kept. And the million-dollar question is the ordering of all of these things. The metaphysical capacity for out-of-body experience, that has to be kept. All of these have to be kept. The question is, how do they go together, right? What is the way they go together? Well, that is a meta-modern design question. That's why it's so valuable. How does modernism, postmodernism, traditionalism, romanticism, all these things matter? They have to be braided in the right way. It has to be architectured. It has to be designed in the right way, or interiority does not come out, quote unquote. The invitation does not come out. So it goes with human teleology. If the human being is not rightly braided together, if they are not rightly ordered, then what is the human, quote unquote, does not come out. And the experience of the human coming out is in nous. It is in the experience of the beautiful, of which is evident of some sort of right ordering, and whatever increases the probability of those experiences is right ordering of the human being, but it must necessarily not be that which is quantifiable, because if it was show, it wouldn't have the alive characteristic of a universe knowing itself per se. It has to have this organic unfolding. And actually, this would also suggest why actually fear must always be in the system, because there must always be a thing you can face to create energy and courage, right? There must always be the possibility of fear for the possibility of negentropy. Even fear itself needs to be an ever-present possibility, so that you always have a new opportunity for actually knowing yourself more in terms of courage, because knowing yourself in terms of courage is the actual knowing of yourself. If you don't know yourself in terms of courage, then you actually don't know yourself. You've actually dissected yourself into ideas. So the possibility of fear is actually the ever-present possibility of negentropic potential and the universe knowing itself in a different way, using the Dempsey sort of understanding, right? And so that also kind of suggests where fear is actually fear is there to be faced, right? And if you don't face it, then you're actually treating fear as something to get rid of, versus having almost a redemptive role and always being something you can face. And I would also strongly connect the ability to experience beauty and the ability to face fear. And of course, facing fear increases agency, and what you experience is beautiful increases gratitude. That must be elaborated on, but let me give it to Rivera. Mr. Rivera, good to see you this evening, sir. Thank you for coming back.
Hey, yeah, nice. I was trying to sneak in a call while I was at work. That didn't work.
I'm in the bathroom.
But
I'm in the bathroom.
okay. Man, damn, I really wish I was here this whole time. So I'm kind of tracking what's going on. Probably not too much, but yeah, so a lot of things good said already. So Michael said something about, the boredom, this fear, you can kind of like not be afraid of death. And strangely enough, Michael, you actually like really connected something to me as I'm like reading Heidegger, that I didn't realize, because I don't it's like the fear of death, like I think it's definitely an existential fear. Like it can't, like the way I'm thinking of it is, I think like fear, just like when we're just talking about death, fear of dying. Yeah, there might be some of that or not of that, but I think what really gives it like the oomph is whether you're living a fulfilling life that adds to the fear of death or not. Like whether, because I think in that example you gave, I definitely read it as, in his view, life wasn't fulfilling, so it was worth doing this maneuver to see what he could get out of it. Or you could say it's the only possible way of getting a fulfilling life, by playing with a kind of like, I'm going to take something poisonous kind of maneuver. So I thought that was really interesting about relating fulfilling life, fear, and death. So that's just a side note. Now this idea of like the oneness of experience and stuff like that. Now, Daniel, that was really interesting because like you made me think like there's probably a whole historiology about like misinterpreting these experiences and like their consequences. Like I didn't even like think about that, but like, yeah, I totally agree, because I mean, one, the oneness of experience, or I doubt pure experience of anything, one, but I think the main point is that what's the point of having this experience, right? Like, even if we call it oneness, what's the point of having this experience? Because you could say like a lot of like spiritual people, like I talk to sometimes, they'll be like, man, this changed me, but like, but for some reason they walk away like as if like they know everything now, which is, weird to me. Like they experience the universe, they know the truth now. It's weird because like if you know the truth, it's like, well, what are you gonna do with that now? What are you gonna do with that? So it has to be in relation. And I guess to put it this way, to me, oneness can only be if it's true, right? Let's just say there's oneness in experience when we have these, moments. What's the point of having them? Well, to me, it has to come back to like something like virtue, right? It has to come back to like, you have to feedback loop the experience. It's kind of like proofing the math equation that you solved. You're going to reproof it, see if you actually came back to the way you solved it, comes back to the way you approached it. So in order for you to prove your experience, you have to go back into the virtue side and see how that comes out. Because I think Daniel made a wonderful point about how people interpreted previous experiences. And he's like, that made a caste system. And I was like, yeah, that would make sense. So yeah, we have to go back and prove it. So to me, I don't have too much stakes for like arguing whether an experience has oneness or not, but I have more stakes in looking at how does it lead back to my reality with people in the world, and that, because to me that's actually what matters. It's like, when you follow like these meditation like manuals and like mystics telling you about ecstasies and like all these other stuff and like moments of like these oneness, it's really like more often than not, they're like distracting. They're like kind of distracting. And then the other thing is like, yeah, God gives you a bone here, every now and then just to tell you that you're doing a good job, but like don't make that the thing. uh so yeah, so I guess what I'm saying is just like this, definitely a call back to virtue being circled. Because I definitely think the body is like, I like Heidegger's circumspection now because I think it's such a useful thing. Like this action by knowing. I just wish that he would have done the body some justice here. But yeah, for some reason I believe religious circumspection is like definitely the coolest ways to access these things that we're talking about, as a way of knowing. Of course, it's not going to be like our theoretical kind of knowing, but I think it's that kind of self-proofing that we can do, because it can go back into virtue, beauty, nous, as you guys were bringing up nous. But yeah, I don't have anything else, and I can't stay too long after this. But yeah.
No, I think that's fantastic. Well, so there's a few things. You almost need some sort of mystical anthropology or mystical phenomenology that has to be considered if I use mystical as a catchword for all of this. I think also what's very interesting is often mystical experience was tied with prophecy and was inherently tied to doing something, an action. The problem is now we almost talk about mystical experience versus, dare I say, mystical prophecy. Because the word prophecy, like in the Bible, I just keep you, they're like, God, I didn't hear you. Let me run. Like, can you imagine God speaking to you? Like, that would be a mystical experience, right? And then you say, hey, and Jonah, and you run, right? Like, there's often what's interesting now is there can be an emphasis on having a mystical experience or looking to have an out of body or looking to have some sort of divine experience. When, funny enough, you can see in some religious traditions an idea of, oh, don't do that. You'll have a calling. You'll be sent out. Oh, you want to play with fire? Oh, well, the fire might actually choose you. And so there's a certain mystical tourism that is kind of going on that is also problematic. And I think also, funny enough, again, I do look, it's like I think about the conversations between Simone Weil and the church, even someone like Simone Weil, who clearly was having mystical visions. She thought it was really important that she first talked to the church, the priest, before she made it public. She's like, is it a devil? Is it actually God? Like, there was not an assumption in Simone Weil that a mystical experience was necessarily God, or if it necessarily was supposed to be made public. And you see that in the mystics, goodness. They understood that dealing with mystical things did not necessarily make self-evident the way to go about it afterwards, right? Like, again, you even have traditions of out of body being seen as magic and dangerous, because now you know God, right? Like an out of body experience can be a dangerous thing, right? Or it could be a gift because it's what's the term? Like the transportation, transmutate, like taken out of body into the heavens, third heaven sent right back. Like, so it's very interesting because basically, again, and this I think is to Sam's point, when you study other cultures, other traditions, they don't assume out of body means good. Like, we just tend to do that no more than we don't assume food equals good. It depends on the calories. It depends on what the composition is. I think very often there is a better awareness of this. And like, just because it's metaphysical, you should not assume it was a good thing, right? It could be like a dream could be a bad thing if you misread it. It could be a gift from God. Like, we just don't have, I almost want to say metaphysical sensibility. I'm using metaphysical as a catchword. We're very sensitive about food, sensible about environment, sensible about maybe some sort of more scientific quantifiable things, but we actually are quite simplistic when it comes to these kind of experiences. There's just, oh, it's great. Oh, it's good. Like, that's what we should seek it. We should go after it. But really, it's tied to virtue. It's like, well, you better make sure you have some virtue before you have a mystical experience or an out, because it might destroy you. Or you might be sent out, and actually, of course, Jesus has that crazy line where he's like, if you remove a demon, make sure you put something in its place or 7 more will come in. We'll think, whoa. You just said remove a demon casually. That's just something a person can do. They can just remove a demon. He's like, yeah, you cast out demons, but actually that's really dangerous because if you do that and you're not ready, you could make it way, way worse. There's just a much more nuanced language over these things that we, I think, have lost, which if we regained, then we wouldn't, well, then what's the difference? Is it really an ego death? Is that really what you experience? Okay, is it really out of body? Is that, maybe that's not good because we're supposed to bring the body into new creation or different things, right? There would be a way to talk about these things that are not, well, we can't talk about it because we're embarrassed by them. Like that's the unintentional consequence to Sam's point. Like if we're not even allowed to talk about these things because it's crazy, well, of course you're not going to create a nuanced language and ability to navigate these experiences because talking about them at all is dumb. And actually, that to me gets to the greatest casualty. What ends up happening regarding things you're not allowed to talk about is they blur. They blur together. And blur is the opposite of relation. They seem the same. Blurring is the opposite of relationship. Blurring is where you act like there's a relationship, but it's actually a laziness. Relationship is earned. Blurring is slathered, per se. Like blurring is lazy. It's where you're trying to create, good to see you, Mr. Rivera. It's where you're trying to create relationships through just blurring them versus earning them, right? And if you can't talk about things, and you can't think about things, or you're not expanding your lens to see differences across cultures and different traditions, then you end up blurring a lot of things together that actually could lead to unintentional consequences. But let me give it to Michael and then Sam. Michael, please.
Yeah, it's funny to think, people like are so risk averse in so many ways, like they won't go out in a rainstorm. They, are like aware of what food they're eating. They're always buying organic, but like the amount of people that are willing to just buy a one-way ticket to Peru and march into the rainforest with a shaman to take ayahuasca, like in search of a mystical experience, like they're they're not very they're not very discerning when it comes to that, right? And I mean, there's countless stories of people on psychedelic trips being visited by demonic figures, having past traumas resurface, like it being a torturous experience. And so there's 100, and in mental health care, like there's certainly an awareness of treading carefully when it comes to dealing with past traumas, dealing with dreams, 100%. I mean, Jung was definitely aware of that as well, of like it being a very treacherous frontier to kind of traverse with people, and to really make sure you're meeting people where they are and not not forcing people to go into situations that they're not comfortable with. So I think that's like totally a valid concern, and I think too, like what Javier was talking about, where it seems like a lot of mystics, whether they had this agenda or not, but like if you read a mystic, it's very hard to not come away with this desire to experience what mystics have experienced, and to have these deeply spiritual moments, and I think it can give the false notion that should be the ultimate goal of life, is to have these ecstatic experiences, to have these peak experiences. And I think what he said about kind of, not to bring it back to the so what of it all, but like the so what of that experience to be tied to the integration of it, which is where virtue comes in, which is how do you take this unlocking of this depth of interiority and not kind of fetishize it, not put it on a pedestal, not glamorize it, not kind of fall in love with the nostalgic idea of it, but like put it into your life. And I think inevitably one has to face fear to be able to do that. Um, like I'm reminded again of this book that I brought up on here before called The Exorcist After the Ecstasy, the Laundry. It was written by Jack Kornfield, very well-known meditation teacher. Yeah. And the book is essentially a compilation of these vignettes of these people who go off and have these mystical experiences and struggle to come back to their life. And some of it is kind of just a natural byproduct of having a paradigm shift. Is you come back and you realize that the old life you were living is not harmonious or not consonant with this new life, and it kind of results in a lot of destruction or disruption. But a lot of people are like they they uh they seem to really struggle to appreciate the mundaneness of life, and seek a return back to the mountain in Tibet, and it's almost like this like kind of dream that keeps like kind of yanking them from the present. Um, and the last thing before I pass it back, my therapist a couple sessions ago said that he was journaling one day, and this phrase occurred to him that God is also the clouds. And he said he's always struggled to find God in the mundane and the everyday. Like it's always been easy for him to see God in the light, and it's always been easy for him to see, in the kind of dark night of the soul, the presence of God. But like oh, your taxes are due. Oh, you got to take the kids to school. Oh, like, you got to fold the laundry. Like that's always been a struggle for him. And he said when he wrote that, he went to the post office and he had this like ecstatic experience of just like being in the post office and like just like he was just, I don't know. And I that seems I just had the thought the other day, like if you can really enjoy making your breakfast that you make every day, like just the cracking of the eggs, the sizzling of the bacon, like, and just like really like that being something that you like thoroughly enjoy, like haven't you kind of like won the game? Like like where like so many people are like dreading most of their life to get to the like 1% of their day or whatever, their week that's like super exciting. Like if you can enjoy and find meaning in like the the most trivial of tasks, like, well, that's 99% of life, then you've kind of like cracked the code. But yeah, I'll pass it back.
No, you're saying some very important things, and I'll give it to Sam. There is something about one's quality of gratitude tied to the mysticism they can handle and have experienced. That there is a connection between mysticism and gratitude, and there is also something about mysticism that increases agency. There also seems to be something about maturity, which is gaining capacity for mysticism and able to integrate it. Because there's something here, like Oswald Chambers talks about the danger, the importance of a mountaintop experience, but then the danger of staying on the mountain, right? I shall also note, actually, this problem that we are discussing that is rearing its head today, I would argue, if we just look at, say, Catholic Church history, this has been a common problem, but since we don't study anything because we're smarter than that, we're just returning to these problems and we think they're new, but actually they're an old problem. Where, there's an issue of like, there's something about mysticism is important, but then how do you not make a holy hierarchy of the people that had it? Then you have the magistrates more important than the laymen. It's like, no, God can use the layman as the magistrate, Protestant Reformation. Then there's an idea of the possibility of transubstantiation, but here's the key, the critical idea of that and actually it gets to the out-of-body conversation. Many Protestants are saying, well, if you're saying that God is turning bread into his body, then you're saying that creation is not good in and of itself. In its materiality, it has to be changed to something else, right? So actually, it was many Protestants thought their many Protestants thought their denial of the Eucharist as the actual body was a higher sacramental view of all of creation being sacramental. Because if God can change materiality, then that means there's materiality that's lacking in goodness. So everything gets very nuanced. Everything that seems arbitrary, actually behind these seemingly silly debates, is an entire metaphysical cosmology that is at stake, right? And this is things we have not thought, and I think we're in trouble as a result. They're also on this idea of the universe learning itself, teaching itself. That learning is mystical learning. That is not logical learning. That is not information learning. There's an old tradition of God is perpetual, and Jockin has mentioned this. There's a tradition that God is every single second experiencing nous, which is a mystical apprehension more so. That when God learned, you know, that whoa moment of learning that is mystical versus interesting, God is every second going, whoa, 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 whoa moment. That's what God experienced. And actually, resurrection or new life is a mode of being that is having that, right? And so when we talk about the universe knowing itself, as I think is being suggested in metamodern ideas like Dempsey is putting forth, the universe is learning itself mystic. It is a mystical learning, because mysticism is a learning, but it is a learning based on apprehension, not logic. Okay. So maturity seems to be about actually increasing mystical capacity and experience. And the ultimate mystical accomplishment seems to be something about the capacity to, in bacon, in laundry, experience something adjacent to the mystical, and have a gratitude of the experience equivalent to the full-on mystical experience, right? That you're able to bring it there. And that seems to be the telos of human beings. That seems to actually be an agency is needed to figure out how to do this. Agency is about conditioning yourself, designing yourself to actually have the mystical, and then be able to keep the mystical, and then not be regretting not being in the mystical. Because this would also be, if I were to, on this learning process notion, and then I'll give it to Sam. So maybe there's an idea where the universe learns, if we use that, oh, I can have mystical through an ego death. Well, could I have a mystical with an ego? Let's try that. And then when it learns to do that, it's like, okay, can we have a mystical out of body? Yes. Well, let's see if we can do it in body, right? Because a universe that was incapable of having the mystical in a condition would not be as great as a universe that could have it in any possible condition. And it has to go through a learning process of doing every single configuration and type to actually come to figure out how to be non-contingently able to experience the mystical. So then perhaps there was a time where out-of-body experience for the mystical was a necessary learning curve to get that capacity. But then if you keep doing that, you regress. Maybe ego death was a necessary period, but then if you regress in time, you're going backwards in the learning, right? So then you need to be able to have mystical with ego and a certain self-forgetfulness, right? So then there was a time where humans didn't know to have, we didn't know how to have mystical at all, and we learned to do it in isolation. But then when we learned to do it in isolation, can we now do it in relationship? Okay, we learned how to do it. Well, can we do it in diversity, right? Every single possible breaking up, like if there's a possible configuration in which the mystical is limited, then the universe has a challenge it needs to learn to overcome, or humans have a challenge they need to overcome, right? And the marker that the challenge has been overcome is the quality experience of the mystical, right? Because going back to metamodern, even if I don't know if, God actually exists or not, I know that mystical experience actually occurred. That is a safe, and no one asks, how do I know the mystical actually happened in terms of interiority? There's certainty is created real fast. Cartesian doubt is not there. Cartesian doubt is the product of logos. Apprehension, you don't have that problem, right? And so the marker of mysticism also, funny enough, in its strong quality of being there, functions to hold you up. There's also this old debate of providence and agency and free will, right? Like how if God is in control. Well, there's an interesting way where the mystical has a certain support that it allows agency to then operate on if you can integrate it in, right? But then there's a guidance of the levels, because you're talking about psychedelics. There's clear evidence that people can overcome traumas with psychedelics, but then with it, they can have traumas with it. There's evidence that out of body can be great, but then it makes people suicidal. It's like anything. Everything is both. It has to be. How could it not be? Because everything has to entail an infinite possible arrangements and circumstances, and it's only probable that some range of those would be unoptimal, right? And bad, and so on and so forth, right? And also, basically, the learning of the universe seems to be tied to learning the order of things in the universe. Not simply the possibilities, but the ordering of those possibilities is also the complexity. And some ordering seem to have more mystical potential than others. And of course, the mystical here is also tied to the beautiful and the strike of beauty and things like that, right? So there's another side of this as well, and I'll give it to Sam, on tying the question of maturity and learning to mysticism, that also one's life, I do think generally, like, aging is supposed to be a kind of process of gaining capacity for the mystical. Like, the kind of mystical, your capacity for the mystical at age 10 should not be the same at age 40 or age 80. There should be growing. And I think this is really important, because right now we think maturity is learning and making money and getting a career and things like that, right? No, maturity is gaining mystical capacity, right? Like that, and you could argue that's why life has meaning, because there's always more mystical capacity. And really, too, tied to mystical capacity is also the ability to remember mystical experiences or moments. This is where Plato tied memory into this. There's something about memory in mysticism that is going on. And also maturity is tied to the ability to remember and to then have new apprehensions, and then in virtue to integrate them and to get to the place where doing the laundry or the bacon have that certain mystical apprehension. Because that experience is seemingly the sweet spot of gratitude and agency. That experience is where agency, because basically this is what is being said. If you had the ability, what if you had the ability in anything you did, ergo any use of agency, you could experience as mystical? Well, if you could, you'd be grateful for it. Basically, agency then is simply the unfolding of that of which you will be grateful for under any possible condition. So agency is the creative space. Agency, it is the creative unfolding of, and wherever agency goes, you're grateful for it. And in fact, you have that apprehension of beauty. So agency then at that point of mysticism is the directionality of gratitude. And gratitude is a creative act in of itself. This is what's very interesting. Gratitude becomes creative. You know, gratitude becomes like gratitude is creativity then at that point. Like gratitude is the very motivation of participation that creates a new qualia of unfolding that then makes more gratitude and more qualia, because in a sense, bacon that you experience as mystical has been created. It is now a new work of art. Bacon you don't experience as mystical is caused. Bacon you experience as mystical is created. And so the act of gratitude is a creative act because it changes the way you experience things. And in that makes a feedback loop that goes on and on and on. And there is some sort of fittingness of the human in what they are to do this sort of thing that suggests what is teleological of humans, that is not overly weighed down by the actual or overly opened by the possible into chaos, but actually is found in gratitude, the blending, the braiding of actuality and possibility into an apprehension that is in of itself creative and unfolded. But I'll pause it. Let me give it to Sam. Sam.
I thought it was so funny that Javier should bring up this "so what" point, actually, because it was something we had discussed without him being there. And I actually wanted to, in lieu of what you're saying now, apply a little bit of friction to his conclusion, which is that it's tied to the virtuous. And maybe this is my own misunderstanding, actually. But yeah, I wanted to say, it made me think of the Callistes. They're like this heretical Christian sect in Russia. And their most famous member was Rasputin, and part of their how they practice was they had this term called dark courage, and so the idea was that in order, and I think this takes what Javier is saying and brings it back into like but if we frame that in what you're saying, like the world is a process of knowing itself, the dark courage was the thought was like the way that we know the full depth and breadth of God's grace and mercy is actually by sinning. And so you need to have the dark courage to sin. And I think that sort of it puts a bit of a disruption on this whole like we have to do virtuous things kind of thing. Like I think what you're saying is important. Like there is an order, there is a hierarchy and everything. But um, at the same time, like, you know, like the good isn't in the world. And you know, like in the Platonic trinity of good, beauty, and truth and good aren't here. We just have the beauty to like to strike us and to orient us. We don't know what good is. That's God's, you know, like that's God's purview. Um, and it's not logical. It's not, oh, you know, like Kantian or moralism, like, you know, you can't deduct what is good. And but you can nonetheless you can know God's grace and you can see his mercy you can apprehend it and through a dark courage. And I just yeah, I just wanted to like I think what you're saying with the gratitude and agency thing, maybe that is where this ties in is like um agency we think is oriented towards the future. We don't think it can do anything about the past. Gratitude, we think it's only oriented towards the past. We don't think it can do anything about the future. But if you combine the two, then you have this willingness towards unmediated gratitude, which is, as you're saying, creative, therefore agentic. It's the agency it's the combination of both. It's the set agency gratitude, and it's an orientation towards the future, which is expansive.
Beautiful. 100%. No, very good point on the virtue. On the idea of virtue, the problem, like when Jacques and Javier and Luba are talking, there's also this problem where virtue has been separated from vitality. Vitality and virtue now just means moralization, right? And so also the problem is virtue actually doesn't exist without the beautiful or the facing fears, right? Because here's the problem. I can always come up with a possible virtue. And if I'm crafty enough, basically, I can always do that. And who are you to say that isn't a virtue? Because, aren't you afraid that if you don't sin, God's going to send you to hell? So you ought to face that. And that will be a good thing to do, right? But this is also why the beautiful and metamodernism, as it's described, is so important. Because basically, without a strike, without some sort of mystical, then you can always creatively come up with, because the good and the true are susceptible to internally consistent systems, as I'll call it, maps. They can always move the pieces. Basically, virtue, as what it actually would be, is going to be tied to not letting yourself move the pieces around. And in fact, actually catch yourself when you're moving the pieces around, because now you're not waiting for the strike of beauty. So for example, if I'm looking at something or thinking about myself, suddenly I'll be like, wow, I haven't actually just apprehended and experienced this thing for 3 minutes. Oh, that's actually a lack of virtue, because I'm letting the logos too much override my experience of the thing. And so actually you'll feel there's a really odd way in which when you feel that vitality going away, virtue is going away. Virtue is kind of experienced. Like when you feel yourself going into anger or getting mad, or you're in that voice in your head talking about all the people that screwed you and that person has no idea what you've done, you're doing that head, that is the feeling of not being in virtue, because virtue is tied to a loss of vitality. And what you're feeling there is the loss of virtue is where energy goes inward. It goes inward, and what does it do? It crushes you. It's trying to make you a black hole, basically. And actually, when you're really mad, you are kind of black hole, aren't you? Like I feel you're trying to get away, and you just keep coming back. You just keep coming back to it, right? But that's where you're not sublating the anger, as we had that conversation, in the direction we talked about, because it's actually it's a good energy. It's just got the wrong direction, right? And so the thing is, virtue is direction. Like, is the thing going out? Virtue is what makes go out. And unfortunately, a lot of our understanding of virtue is far too limited. Yes, lying tends to make you go inward, quote unquote, because then you have to think about how to maintain the lie, and you're worried about getting caught, so you're going in. So virtue tends to correspond with honesty, right? You murder someone, guilt, same thing, right? But what's critical is sometimes in the virtue conversation, the logic behind all of those principles is not made straightforward. And if you did that, you would actually generally go from every moment of your day asking, am I experiencing things in a way that make me go in or out, right? And, sometimes you need logic because something's in the way from you going out, but then you can have the logic actually just be the only thing that you're doing and you're always going in now, right? But every moment, well, this is the other tricky thing. And this is why also virtue ultimately seems to lead to something like artfulness, like an artfulness in being, because a thing that was good to do 5 minutes ago, 5 minutes later could be bad to do. And then 5 minutes from that could be good again. And then 5 minutes. But this is like if Socrates, know thyself is this, keeping up with this, it's a much more useful notion. Know thyself has become a stagnant idea. It's become a static definition when really it's paying attention to yourself more so. Like know thyself is, I think, better Simone Weil attention, like attention to thyself, right? Because the thing that is good to do right now, a moment later may not be. And that's the trickiness to being. And dare I say the mystical, and then I'll give it to Michael, and then I'll ask, I will have to go in like 10 or so minutes. This has been completely delightful. Is that there's the mystical notion. I know we've had a good time, but that's the interiority. You're in the thing, you lose it, right? So that mystical orientation seems to also be tied to a certain sort of awareness that every footstep actually has to be paid attention to. Every picking up of a piece of bread, every folding of the laundry has to be paid attention to. The demonic opposite of this is paranoia. And actually, paranoia, in a weird way, or anxiety, is pointing to a good that humans have if it's fitted with mysticism. Like anxiety is a human capacity of attention that has not been anchored by mysticism. And so you're all over the place. Mysticism has you have a sane depthness of attention, but you enjoy it. You are grateful for it. That's what ends up happening. Like you're like aware of everything. It's like, wow, like that is actually then becomes an enjoyment. Where in anxiety, it becomes a torture because it hasn't been given the mystical anchor by which to sublate it into that ever attentiveness that is ever enjoyment and actually makes things come forth as beauty. But Michael, please.
Yeah, I'm reminded that Ian McGilchrist talks about attention, attention as a moral act, I think is what he says. And he probably wouldn't talk about moral in like the traditional like Kantian way of being moral, but I think for him it's like to, you know, to see eternity in a grain of sand kind of idea of like being able to fixate one's attention on the beauty of the world is like a gateway into its like ever lasting infinite depths of like, you know, mystical yeah, you know, mystical presence. Um and I also love what you said about the artfulness of being. That's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, is like life as a creative act, and expanding it beyond just, you know, the formal practice, the formal creative artful practices that we do, whether that be writing, painting, you know, whatever it might be. And like, you know, if you're really attuning to yourself and the environment around you, like what you will find salient, what you will find interesting, what you will be compelled to do is always changing. I'm listening right now to an incredible conversation with Jordan Hall and Guy Sengstock that just dropped like a couple days ago. Daniel, I think you'd love it. And Jordan again is talking about his experience with the hurricane in the beginning, and he talks about how like in the beginning days when, you know, everyone's internet was down and you couldn't drive anywhere, and you know, people were kind of freaking out and kind of in pandemonium. Um, he didn't really know like what to do, and so he would go out to his front porch and he would pray every morning. And he said he would just wait for like the most important thing, next thing for him to do to just reveal itself to him. And he said like that's how he just learned to live his life, was just like, you don't have your normal schedule, you don't have your normal routine, like and so in the absence of that, like you really have to just anchor yourself to like faith and the moment and like listening, communing with God, um and so I think that's just like a perfect example of what an artful existence means. And yeah, just last thing before I pass it back, like the way our culture is designed for, you know, productivity and routines and like we can't even hang out with friends anymore without it being like we got to do this and then this and then this. Like it's not incentivized for us to live an artful existence because there isn't the spaciousness allowed to say, oh, today I'd like to do this, but I don't know if I'd like to do it tomorrow. It's like you're locked into a job with a pension plan that you're going to have for the next 40 years of your life, doing the same rote tasks every day. And so to live an artful existence is what you said earlier, Daniel, non-efficient, because it it will very quickly lead to a real discord between you and the machine's way of designing culture, and it will cause you to change your life in really radical ways. But yeah, I'll pass it back.
Magnificent. I very much like what you said on spaciousness now, and this has been wonderful. Thank you both for being here. I've really enjoyed it. And absolutely delightful, Michael and Sam. Thank you again. If you didn't give a plant spaciousness and had set times when it does things, I think it'd die pretty fast. And it just, Seagal, you mentioned Seagal. Oh, hello, cat. Oh my gosh. Oh, I love cats. So Haven's gonna hear this and run in because he wants a cat, and we have like 20 barn cats. Seagal always says, and he's correct on this, that we metaphorically don't think about the universe as a plant. We probably need to prioritize plant metaphors. And again, the Bible's talking about gardens and our agriculture all the time. And I think gardens get closer to human experience because gardens, the funny thing about a garden is it's not predictable, but it's not chaos. You don't know exactly what's going to occur, but you have a pretty good idea of what's going to occur and when it's going to occur, even if you don't know exactly. That lack of exactitude, but presence of knowing, is the balance between freedom and structure, chaos and order, is a garden. A garden is not predictable, but it's not random. And there's something about human beings that is closer to a garden than a machine. But of course, in our freedom, we can identify with a machine and make all of those terrible mistakes, right? But of course, a garden also is automatically a language of relationship, because a garden must have been designed by a human being. Gardens don't really show, wildflowers show up in the woods, but a garden as a phenomenon is fundamentally relational, and it has a design. And a funny thing too, Austin Vera always made the point on the question of evil, like even when you identify something as evil, it must suggest a design in the same way that you can tell the difference between a flower and a weed by the design of the garden. Like there are many weeds that actually look like flowers. You couldn't tell they were a weed just by how they looked. It's because of the design, right? So there's always some sort of design that is at work, right? And design is always relational as well, right? There is always some sort of relation between subject and object and a trace of the subject in the object that has been designed. The question is simply, do we want to get better at apprehending that? Do we want to get better at owning that? And do we want to get better at braiding modern and postmodern and technological and economic incentives in a manner to saturate them to make space for this interiority, right? For it to come out? Do we want to order these things that make up the modern world in such a manner that the trace of the human, of the interior, comes out more so and more so? I think that's part of the challenge, and you could say the universe is learning how to do that. I do think there's something to be said about, we are in an age Like, again, I've emphasized Christianity because I do think we have, if we use this learning model, I think generally people have learned how to be mystics in isolation. I think people have generally learned how to be mystics without a family. They've learned how to be mystics outside of society. We have not yet, and we've learned how to be mystics through dream work and out-of-body experiences and psychedelics and different things. And all of these show avenues of the mystical. What we have not learned how to do is how to be mystical in society using technology with families, with jobs, with pluralism, with difference. There are actually still limits to possibilities of mysticism that have not been learned yet. And that's the work I think that is being done, actually. I think that is the work that is being done. Because the reason why I like thinking of it that way, because then what you're saying is, no, the out-of-body was not a mistake. The ego death was not a mistake. It's not that the Western religions were right or wrong, because they were all on the learning of what is a possible way to do it. And now it's on the next learning way. And maybe when you're 10, you need the just straight up mountaintop out of body experience precisely so that you have a memory to motivate your actions between 10 and 20. So you can then have the next quality mystical in the next 25. Each one of these become markers of development without which you can't have the others. And Eastern religions can be on that, Eastern insights can be on that development, et cetera, so forth, right? So it's all in the same way that postmodern, modern, no one's saying metamodern is the best. It's all in a trajectory of learning, right? But what is clearly not good is if you are incapable of metamodernism, and this is where it becomes more objective. So we said earlier that a modern work that is clearly supposed to be a modern work is good. It's not a failure in a postmodern. The error becomes what is not good is if it is fitting for us to be, say, metamodern, or if it is fitting for us to learn to be mystical in body and family, and we can't. That is the vice. That's where it's not good. The problem is inability when it is now called of you, when it is now fitting, right? So the problem becomes when it is time to do something and you do not have the capacity to do it. And critically, I would also suggest that it is never time for you to do something if it couldn't have been possible for you to do it in that time, right? I think that's almost an axiomatic claim, but I actually do think it's how things work, right? And I would also strongly suggest that basically the determination of if one is so ready, so prepared, is primarily and predominantly a matter of, did you face fears? I think it is basically the number one metric. Because that's kind of the thing. Like, so basically as a pretty good heuristic, look at yourself, and if you say, I have a fear I haven't faced, go face it. And then if you honestly can look, but now critically, you may honestly look at yourself and say, no, not yet. Okay, well then commit to when it inevitably comes again, you're ready for it, and be building your capacity now for the possible things that can come out to always be working. Well, here's also something that should critically be said. Creating spaciousness is not a state of not acting. Often spaciousness can be learning and preparing and conversing. I would say spaciousness is a place of preparation. It's just not a place of plans. And we've conflated plans and preparation. So we're very confused. Preparation creates a feeling of space because as you learn, what happens? The world feels bigger. I think it is very difficult to feel like there's space without learning and talking and meeting and conversations like this. Space is not merely sitting in a room where no one is putting demands on you. It also has to be a metaphysical opening and expansion of what is occurring. And you really cannot do that if you're not participating in the learning of which the whole thing is also engaged in, right? So learning and spaciousness are connected. Unfortunately, people have conflated spaciousness with vacation or not having a job or not having anything on their calendar. That is not spaciousness. That is boredom that our dear beloved Mr. Wallace tried to be a source of interiority. But boredom and spaciousness are not the same. Spaciousness and learning are profoundly tied together. But learning is not the same as memorization. Learning is not the same as stuffing your head with facts in a Dickens novel or something. Facts, it's all facts. Learning is that sense of the ordering of the layers of which then makes one toward, yes, that's true. Sam does have a fire stuck on vacation. Like that makes one toward the learning, right? Now, and again, something like traveling can be part of the learning. There's a problem with never traveling, but then Emerson warns that traveling can become an idolatry. Everything can become an idolatry. Isn't that grand? Everything can be bad because everything can be mystical. And the very potential of everything being mystical is the potential of the disordering in the manner that makes them bad. And here's the problem. The greater the mystical capacity of something, the greater the emptiness if it is approached in the wrong way. And so that is also why it is very important to learn and to integrate. Michael, please, please.
Yeah, no, I know you have to go just really quickly. Vervaeke talks about the very thing that can afford your transcendence is also the thing that can lead to your self-deception. Like they're both intertwined.
Absolutely. I mean, the classic idea that I always love from Dante is the notion of it is only angels that can become demons because they have because of the capacity. Like the taller your glass, the more water it fills if it's full, but if it's dumped out, the more emptiness, right? But this is why mysticism is not treaded lightly. Because if you have the mystical experience, your glass gets tall, it's full of water, but then if you can't integrate it or you dump it out, then it's really empty, right? That's why when people have out-of-body experiences, if they're not ready for it, it can be depressing, right? But then the answer is no mysticism. Then people, that's why, but then of course some more fundamentalist Protestants say, so well then therefore no mysticism. No, none of it. Well, that doesn't work either, because then you're afraid of mysticism. So you can't be afraid of mysticism, but then you have to treat it as with a certain sort of respect, a certain sort of awareness that what we're dealing with matters. And then it's also not self-evident how you should go about that. Well, it's probably a good idea then to, regularly do conversations like this, learn heuristics like facing fears, and then also have a sense of what is the goal, like what is the kind of telos, what is the kind of goal. And I do think, and then I'll close, like, it is tied to this agency gratitude matter, because like, imagine, there's always that kind of idea that wouldn't like heaven be really boring, right? Like if you had infinite time, wouldn't that be hell, right? Timelessness is hell, right? There's always that kind of idea, right? But imagine though, if literally every moment you experienced is beautiful, there was never a moment that wasn't beautiful. Would timelessness then be hell? Absolutely not. If you literally experienced every single moment as beautiful in that strike of beauty, timelessness never becomes hell because you actually don't have a sense of time. You are always in the invitation of the experience of the beautiful, right? So likewise, if you were always grateful for every moment of eternity in the beautiful, then it would never become hell. And also, here's the funny thing. The mystical, the strike of beauty is when you actually weirdly feel like you have the most agency. And yet you're paralyzed with awe, right? There's this weird moment where in these highest moments of mysticism that the individual feels most themselves. They say it all the time. I'm most themselves. It was in the beautiful, it was in the flow that I was most myself. What do you mean? You stood there and didn't do anything. You were just overwhelmed by the light or something, right? We tend to conflate agency with action, like active action, right? When actually a revelation of mysticism is that agency is found in a certain beholding and suspense and awe. That's where the agent is most themselves, because they are what? Saturated. And metamodernism is basically an art trying to create an effect of total saturation, that agency comes most out in that saturation, is most alive, because interiority shines forth. We conflate the proof of agency and action when really it's agency is a matter of shine. That's when agency is at its most, when it shines forth. And what it does, and it shines forth when it receives shine in the strike of beauty and in the mystical. We shine when we are shined upon. It's like that idea that, God's love is his love to him, and back and forth, it creates that feedback loop of all those things in operation, right? Agency arises in the participation of a feedback loop like that, which is not merely action of you alone, because people associate agency as independent action that I do, that shows that I have a certain power, right? Well, agency and power are connected, but mysticism is empowerment. is where you feel an empowerment because you feel filled by that mystical experience and you feel to have most agency. So all of this is to say, if you had the experience to make bacon and experience it as beautiful, you will feel like you have agency. And you easily may feel like you have more agency than, say, the president of the United States or some great CEO or someone. If you literally have the ability to experience every moment as beautiful, then you will experience it as grateful, and you will actually feel like you have control because you have the ability to make things beautiful. Like, that is the greatest control. And critically, everything can be beautiful. So there is no condition that necessarily limits this agency. If you have the agency to experience everything is beautiful, then you have agency in every possible scenario. There is no scenario that means you cannot have agency because you have the ability to see every moment as beautiful, which is ultimately, I think, what is being got at in heaven, and that is ultimately freedom, right? Which would then suggest that if the universe is learning about itself, it could be suggested that the universe is teleologically is learning how to experience every possible moment of itself as beautiful, which is ultimately free, because any moment you experience as beautiful is a moment that you want to keep and not be free from. You find freedom in, and you no longer have to worry about something occurring that you don't find beautiful. So in facing fears, you come to the place where there is nothing to fear because it has all been infused with beauty. And since everything can be beautiful, there is no possible scenario which will necessitate the loss of gratitude and the loss of agency. So gaining that capacity and working toward that capacity, I think, is what is fitting for the human being to engage in, that is marked by these glimmers of eternity through the transience that we refer to as mysticism. An ever greater capacity for that mysticism is precisely maturity, not in terms of rationality or career, but for that capacity that seems to be afforded and granted in spaces like this, where one is learning how to have apprehension, to experience the beautiful, to be in flow without thinking oneself. These sort of things are training us in terms of the virtue and vitality that is found in that experience of all things new. And I think all things are being made new. It's been a pleasure. Thank you all. I've enjoyed it. Sam, Michael, it's been a wonderful evening. Thank you for your time. All the best to you. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sam.